Hey guys, tonight we're diving deep like candlelit chapel, cold stone floor, definitely not what you think deep, into the lives of medieval nuns. Specifically what S3X, yes, that thing they weren't supposed to be having, was really like behind those abbey walls. You're going to hear stories you probably weren't meant to hear. Stories about desire, bodies, pleasure, punishment, and some extremely awkward confessions whispered under stained glass. And let's be honest, you probably won't survive this. If you were 13 years old in medieval Europe and female, and your family had too many mouths to feed or not enough dowries to go around, congrats, you were going to be a nun, or at least sent off to a convent with the strong suggestion that you find God. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, I want to know, what city are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Drop it in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So you're standing at the gates of a stone convent, clutching a bundle of linen and trying not to cry. You're just a kid, really. Maybe 13, maybe 14. Your father kissed you goodbye like he was shipping off livestock. Your mother whispered that this was for the best. They've paid a fee, or maybe made a donation, and now you belong to the church. You belong to silence, to obedience, to God, and to the abbess who now eyes you like she's just been handed a blank scroll she's expected to write scripture on. You walk inside and the first thing you notice is the cold. The stone bites through your thin shoes. The halls echo with your footfalls, but no one talks, not even the older girls. They glance at you with unreadable eyes, and you suddenly realise this isn't just a holy place, it's a controlled one. Desire doesn't die here. It just gets repackaged as devotion. Your first few weeks are dizzying. The rules come faster than you can memorise them. Wake at midnight. Pray in Latin. Fast on Fridays. No meat. No personal mirrors. No idle chatter. Definitely no touching. Not yourself, not others. You're told to mortify the flesh, which is a nice way of saying your body is an enemy, and the best way to win is to pretend it doesn't exist. But here's the thing, your body does exist. It gets warm under the scratchy wool of your habit. It aches from kneeling, it sweats in the cramped chapel, and when you lie awake at night, half hungry from fasting, the only warmth you have is the memory of someone brushing your hand during morning prayers. You weren't expecting that flutter in your chest, you didn't ask for it, but it's there. The church had ways of explaining this. You weren't sinful, your body was. Temptation was like a snake coiling through your ribs, whispering soft things about pleasure. Your job was to beat it down with prayer. But of course, prayer doesn't erase hormones. And not everyone came to the convent voluntarily. Some girls were dumped here after surviving trauma. Others were rebellious daughters, forced into vows to keep family property intact. One girl, older than you, has scars down her back from being corrected at home. Another whispers that she got pregnant, and this was her punishment. The fact is, many of the girls around you didn't come here seeking God. They were trapped by circumstance. That made for a strange sisterhood, one forged not just in holiness, but in quiet rebellion. You learn to read their glances during services. You hear the soft gasps in the dormitories late at night. You see how Sister A is always assigned chores near Sister B, and how they find excuses to touch hands when passing communion plates. Historical records confirm this, though of course they're few and far between. Many convents kept detailed logs, but most were destroyed, sanitized, or simply never admitted. What everyone kind of knew, that humans are humans, even in veils. One real case from 14th century Germany details a novice who repeatedly broke her silence vows to confess she'd had impure thoughts about another nun during Mass. She was punished, but not expelled. Apparently the church believed she could be cured. Spoiler, she wasn't. And while all this is unfolding, let's not forget what's happening outside the convent. The Black Death rolls through towns, killing indiscriminately. Peasants revolt, kings die. And inside your cloistered world, all of that feels distant. Your world is ritual, routine, repression. But it's also humming with 1,000 unspoken feelings no prayer can silence. There's a weird comfort in that, honestly, in the paradox. You start to see your fellow sisters not as paragons of chastity, but as messy, fascinating humans trying to follow a blueprint for sainthood with bodies that are loud and needy and full of longing. One nun fasts until she faints, claiming divine ecstasy, but you saw her watching the abbess with eyes that burned. Another writes a poem about Christ's piercing love that reads suspiciously like erotica. Are they lying, or are they just trying to reconcile the only love they're allowed to name with the feelings they're not? There's an ongoing debate among scholars about how many nuns actually engaged in forbidden acts, S3X or otherwise. Some argue most nuns followed the rules, or at least tried. Others point to confessions, trial records, even a surviving erotic art tucked into the margins of devotional books. It's likely somewhere in the middle. Some resisted. Some succumbed. Most lived in the complicated grey space between. You end your first year tired, changed, and surprisingly alert to things you were never taught to notice. Like how someone's singing voice makes you shiver, how the abbess's gaze lingers a half-second too long, how sometimes when the incense is heavy and the candlelight is low, it feels like the whole room is trembling on the edge of something neither divine nor entirely earthly. And in that trembling, in that hush between the prayers, something very real breathes. You're kneeling on a hard stone floor again, knees pressed into the cold like they're supposed to grow roots. The air smells like wax and old wood, and your breath clouds slightly in front of your face. This part of the chapel was never meant to be warm. The priest chants in Latin, and your lips move with the others, mouthing words you barely understand. In theory, you're here to marry Christ. That's what the vow of chastity is, a spiritual union. And in case you forgot, the church will make a very big, very awkward deal out of it. You've been warned for months. The ceremony will change your life. It's supposed to be your holy wedding, the moment you shed your earthly identity and become the bride of Jesus himself. They dress you in white, drape a veil over your head and give you a ring. No pressure, right? You're not marrying someone who snores or forgets your birthday. You're marrying perfection. Try living up to that. There's incense in the air and the ringing of bells. You kneel again. You recite more vows. You're told to renounce the world and its temptations, and you do it, sort of, at least out loud. But what they don't explain is that temptation doesn't just vanish when you sign the paperwork. It's not like someone throws a switch and your body stops responding to, say, the soft curve of Sister Agnes's jawline, or how the priest's hand lingers on your shoulder a beat too long when giving you the Eucharist. You're still human. This whole system just pretends you're not. You see, celibacy isn't just abstinence. It's an entire spiritual commitment to never experiencing sexual pleasure, alone or with anyone else for the rest of your life. It sounds noble in a sermon, sure, but in practice it's a lot messier. In fact, medieval theologians got themselves into serious knots trying to explain what counts. Is a kiss sinful? A thought? What about dreams you can't control? Can a body be punished for something the mind didn't agree to? Nobody could fully agree, and so the nuns were left to navigate the rules with whatever limited tools they had. Guilt, routine, and whispered advice from older sisters who'd already learned how to walk the tightrope. Some gave in and confessed weakly, hoping shame would wash it away. Others rationalised their feelings, pouring all their emotion into their prayers, calling it devotion. And some just found loopholes. You get your first taste of that during evening recreation, which sounds like something joyful, but mostly involves sitting in silence while stitching or grinding herbs. It's in these long, quiet hours that the glances start to mean more, that laughter gets too soft, too private, that a brush of fingers lingers just a heartbeat longer than it should. You're not blind. You see it happen. And one night, in a moment of accidental honesty, Sister Beatrix mutters, "Better to love a sister than burn with sin." You don't ask what she means, you know exactly, but for now you try to play by the rules. You keep your eyes down. You bathe rarely, because vanity is frowned upon and warm water stirs feelings no one wants to name. You suppress your hunger with fasting, though it only makes your skin more sensitive, your dreams more vivid. And oh, those dreams. No one warned you how brutal your mind could be when it's the only place you're allowed to feel things. The next time you go to confession, you hesitate at the grill. Do you tell the priest what you saw in your mind last night? The warmth, the lips, the aching sense of desire that woke you with your heart hammering like a war drum? You whisper the basics, hoping he doesn't ask for details. He doesn't. He's heard it before. He gives you 3 paternosters and a warning about the devil creeping in through idle thoughts. But deep down, you're not sure it was the devil. It felt a lot more like something you'd buried finally reaching for the light. Historically speaking, this struggle wasn't just personal evil, it was institutional. The church built layers of theology around celibacy to try and tame it, layers that sometimes contradicted each other. One century they taught that virginity was the highest state of purity. The next, they argued that married women could still be holy as long as they obeyed their husbands. The concept of chastity morphed depending on who was in charge and what political tides were turning. And then there's the fringe stuff. One bizarre belief held by some monks was that the Virgin Mary herself had physically intervened to protect certain nuns from temptation. There are old texts claiming that Mary appeared in visions and shielded the nuns' bodies during moments of lust, as if holiness was a kind of divine chastity belt. You can imagine how that made confession even weirder. Forgive me, Father. I saw a vision of the Virgin and she, helped me not sin. Right. But behind all the rituals and theological gymnastics is a simple, uncomfortable truth. Nuns were people with bodies, urges, histories, and sometimes, yes, relationships. Not all of them failed their vows. Many tried, some succeeded, some didn't. And sometimes the failure wasn't a dramatic affair or an illicit tryst. It was a moment alone at night, hands clasped in prayer, heart thudding with thoughts too sharp to speak. There's one nun in your convent, old and bent like a question mark, who never speaks about her past. But once, during kitchen duty, you catch her staring into the fire, her lips moving without sound. You lean closer and realise she's not praying. She's reciting names. Names you don't recognise. Maybe people she knew, maybe people she loved. You'll never know. But her voice is reverent, soft, like she's touching them in memory. The truth is, taking a vow doesn't erase your past. It doesn't silence your cravings or rewrite your memories. It just asks you to bury them under layers of ritual and obedience, and hope that the weight will hold. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. And so as you lie in bed that night, the stone cold beneath you, the linen scratchy against your skin, you wonder, is it holier to deny what you are, or to be honest about it? You're not the only one asking that, and you definitely won't be the last. The convent doesn't sleep so much as it rests with one eye open. Even at night, the silence isn't total. Somewhere there's the rustle of woolen blankets, the creak of old wood, the sigh of someone who's just shifted in a narrow cot. You've stopped expecting privacy. It doesn't exist here. Not during the day, not during the quietest hour before sunrise. Your body might be your own, but your space, your time, your choices, those belong to the convent. Or to God, depending on who you ask. You wake before dawn, always. The bell rings in the dark like a slow, deliberate summons. You roll out of bed, aching, and join the shivering line of other women heading toward the chapel. Your breath fogs the air as you move through long, echoing corridors, feet nearly silent on the cold flagstones. No one speaks, not even a whisper. It's part reverence, part survival. Words invite attention. Attention invites punishment. The chapel isn't much warmer. You kneel on bare stone, muscles clenched to stay upright as the psalms begin. They drone on, melodic but distant, like a song being hummed from beneath a lake. The rhythm is meant to soothe you, to pull your thoughts into line. But your thoughts rarely stay in line. They slide sideways. They linger on forbidden memories, or something someone said yesterday that made you laugh harder than you should have. That kind of joy is dangerous. It makes you visible. Convent life is engineered to suppress temptation. It's not just about vows. It's about architecture, schedules, and supervision. The walls are thick, the windows small, the doors always just a bit too heavy to sneak through. The rooms are sparse, a bed, a wash basin, a crucifix. There are no mirrors, because vanity is a gateway sin. No locks on the doors, because privacy breeds secrets. And every minute of your day is accounted for. Prayer, work, study, silence, repeat. The routine is strict by design. An idle nun is a sinful nun. And yet even here in this fortress of obedience, desire finds cracks. Maybe it shows up in the way someone's voice trembles when reading aloud, or the way a hand brushes yours when passing the bread. You're constantly being reminded that you are not just spirit, you're flesh, and flesh remembers. There's a moment, late one afternoon, when you catch a glimpse of something you weren't supposed to see. Two older nuns, heads bowed together in the garden, too close. One touches the other's cheek, just for a second. You don't tell anyone, of course, you wouldn't dare, but the image clings to you for days. Not because it was scandalous, though it was, but because it looks so tender, so human. Historically, scholars have debated just how often these kinds of emotional or physical bonds formed between nuns. Some argue that deep, affectionate friendships were common, and even encouraged, as long as they stayed chaste. Others say the line between friendship and intimacy was often blurred, especially in environments where women were isolated from the outside world for decades. You've heard the older sisters joke that a convent is just high school with more incense. They're not entirely wrong. And here's a quirky little detail. Some convents used architectural design to enforce purity. Shared dormitories weren't just about saving space, they were about surveillance. Bathing areas were open and scheduled. Even the latrines were built with long wooden benches side by side so no one could sneak off alone. If you wanted to have a private moment, you had to get creative, or very fast. One notorious 15th century abbess ordered peepholes installed in walls so that younger nuns could be monitored for mischief. Let's just say it didn't improve morale. The control extended to relationships with the outside world too. Letters were censored, visitors were rare and always chaperoned. If a woman had once been married or engaged before taking her vows, she was often kept under closer watch. And if a priest showed too much friendliness to a particular sister, that raised flags too. But of course none of this was foolproof. You start to realise that despite the constant surveillance, the system mostly runs on fear, on shame. You keep yourself in line not because someone's always watching, but because the risk of discovery is unbearable. Punishment here isn't always physical, though sometimes it is. More often it's isolation, public shaming, days of silent meals, eating on the floor with your back to the others, or worse, having to stand and confess your impurity aloud in front of everyone, while they pretend not to flinch. You've seen it happen once. A girl named Clara was caught touching herself during midday rest. She was maybe 15. The abbess made her kneel at the altar during Vespers, head bowed while the rest of the sisters filed past her. No one spoke to her for 3 days. After that, she barely talked at all. She looked like something had been scooped out of her and never returned. And yet, even knowing all this, your thoughts keep drifting. Not always to something overtly carnal, sometimes just to warmth, to connection, to the way your heart lifts when someone laughs at your joke or offers you a second slice of bread at dinner. That kind of closeness, even when it's non-sexual, can still feel like rebellion in a place designed to keep you isolated from the world and even from yourself. One day, during afternoon chores, a younger novice leans in and says, "Do you ever just miss touching things?" She's talking about softness, velvet, hair, silk, skin. You nod, and she smiles like you have just shared a secret. In a way, you have. You've both admitted that your bodies haven't stopped needing comfort just because your souls are under lock and key. The church didn't always know what to do with this reality. There are records, few and heavily edited, of abbots and bishops trying to reform disorderly convents where affection was too visible. Sometimes those reforms meant sending the women away. Sometimes it meant exiling the abbess. In one Italian convent, an entire group of sisters was forcibly relocated after accusations of inappropriate emotional entanglements. Historians still debate whether the charges were real or politically motivated, but the message was clear. Desire, even implied, was dangerous. Still, you learn to live within the system. You learn how to smile with your eyes, how to lean close without touching, how to turn your thoughts inward and pretend that Christ is enough. Sometimes he is, sometimes he isn't. And sometimes, just sometimes, when you're alone in the library, with a shaft of sunlight warming the ancient wood, you think, maybe this isn't about purity at all. Maybe it's about control, and that realization hums in your chest like a lit fuse. The rulebook for your life, quite literally, sits on a worn wooden lectern in the chapter house, a thick, hand-copied manuscript bound in leather and exhaustion. It's called the Rule of St. Benedict, and it's been bossing around monks and nuns since the 6th century. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of a user's manual for becoming spiritually bulletproof. Or, less charitably, a list of ways to keep you obedient, clean, and just tired enough not to commit any major sins. You've read parts of it aloud during meetings, or listened as the abbess recited its more spine-straightening chapters. Idleness is the enemy of the soul. Let the novice not associate with the older nuns outside of permission. Let there be no murmuring. No murmuring, can you imagine that? No venting, no gossiping, no late-night whisper laughs about how the abbess's nose twitches when she's angry. Just silence, obedience, and unrelenting spiritual posture. But here's the thing. The rule wasn't written to crush you, not exactly. It was supposed to guide you toward a holy life, and in many ways it works like clockwork. You pray at set times, You work in designated spaces. You eat plain food in measured quantities. Your life, in theory, is perfectly balanced between ora et labora, prayer and labour. But in practice, what it mostly feels like is that someone looked at every possible form of joy and figured out how to schedule it out of existence. And you can feel how deeply that design touches everything. Privacy, for instance, doesn't just disappear. It's deliberately erased. Your bed is inches from your neighbours. Your prayers are said aloud, your letters are read before they're sent. Even your confessions, whispered though they are, feel like they're not entirely secret. You get the impression the abbess always knows more than she says. That loss of solitude does something strange to your thoughts. When you're never alone, your mind becomes the only private room you have left. And naturally, it starts misbehaving. You find yourself replaying moments, reliving glances, quietly building a cathedral of memory around things you're not supposed to want. One time you were brushing Sister Helene's hair, something permitted on feast days, and she closed her eyes and let out the softest sigh. You didn't touch her differently, but that sound has echoed in your brain for months. You try to banish it with psalms. It doesn't work. The rule is strictest when it comes to bodies. You wash once a week, maybe less in winter. The point is to dull the senses, not wake them. You wear the same scratchy habit every day. You eat boiled vegetables, stale bread, watered wine. It's not suffering exactly. It's engineered neutrality. Food that doesn't excite. Clothes that don't flatter. Baths that don't linger. You're not supposed to feel much of anything. But of course you do. The flesh is loud, it rebels. Sometimes in harmless ways. You catch yourself humming a tune from the outside world. Other times in ways that make your breath hitch. At night under your rough blanket, guilt blooming across your chest like a bruise. The rule says nothing about the dreams. It doesn't say what to do when you wake up sweating, your fingers tangled in the sheets, heart racing from something you didn't ask for. You usually go straight to confession the next day. The priest rarely reacts. He just reminds you that Satan is patient. The official line is that these impulses are tests, opportunities for spiritual refinement. But it's hard not to wonder, why give us bodies at all, if we're meant to pretend they don't exist? And then there are the silence rules. Oh, the silence. There's a designated time for speaking, usually during meals and only with permission. The rest of the day is punctuated with gestures, nods, quick looks. A whole underground language grows in that silence. You learn to say entire paragraphs with your eyes. Sometimes when you really need to talk, you sneak behind the herb shed with someone you trust and whisper, just enough to feel like yourself again. But it's risky. If you're caught, it's penance, and possibly a transfer to another house if they think you're becoming too attached. Speaking of attachment, the rule doesn't forbid friendship, but it does warn against particular attachments. That's Benedictine for don't get too close to anyone, or we'll start asking questions. You see the consequences of breaking that one when two novices, Sister Eleanor and Sister Maren, start avoiding each other overnight. They used to be inseparable. Now they barely make eye contact. You don't ask what happened. You already know not all. Someone saw something, someone spoke. You think about them often. About how fragile intimacy is here. How easily it's stripped away. It makes you hyper-aware of your own connections. You try not to get too close to anyone. But even that is a kind of loneliness, one that hums under your skin, heavy and unshakable. You can't touch, you can't speak freely, you can't even laugh too loud. But your body still wants warmth. Your soul still wants contact. The more the rule forbids, the more you crave. And here's a fun fringe fact. In one particularly intense monastery, the abbess introduced a rule where no one was allowed to look anyone else in the eye during prayer. To prevent impure thoughts, she said. Which is hilarious, because if anything, that just made you more aware of each other. Like, congratulations, you've just turned every sideways glance into an erotic novella. But maybe that's the point. The rule doesn't erase desire. It frames it as danger. It teaches you to fear it, suppress it, or redirect it toward God. That's where you get nuns who write poetry about Christ's body, his wounds, his blood, using language that, let's be honest, feels a little too breathy to be purely devotional. One such mystic, Mechtilde of Magdeburg, famously described her union with Christ in terms that bordered on the sensual. She wrote of melting in the fire of his love and pressing against his holy side. Some scholars argue this was purely metaphorical. Others say it's just another example of how the only safe outlet for female desire in the Middle Ages was to dress it up in spiritual drag. You lie in bed that night. the rule echoing in your head like a scold. No murmuring, no vanity, no special friendships, no eye contact even. But your body doesn't care. It wants what it wants. Softness. Nearness. Understanding. You wonder if God understands. You hope so, because the rule sure doesn't. It starts with a phrase you've heard 100 times by now. You are married to Christ. Everyone says it with a kind of reverent finality, as though that should clear up all your confusion, cancel every ache, and hand you the blueprint for a perfect life, married to Christ. It's said like a comfort, but mostly it just adds another layer of weirdness to the already confusing business of desire. Because what does that actually mean? Is he watching you all the time? Does he know when your thoughts wander? Is he jealous? When you first took your vows, the language made you feel holy, chosen, special even. You walked down the nave in white, carrying a candle, the choir chanting around you. It felt solemn, real. And the ring, the one they slid onto your finger, binding you to an invisible groom, sparkled like a promise. But the longer you stay inside the convent walls, the more you realise how complicated this so-called marriage really is. Because unlike an actual husband, Christ doesn't talk back. He doesn't help with laundry. He doesn't sneak you bread from the kitchens when you're too tired to chew another boiled leek. What you get instead are statues, icons, a crucifix above your bed that watches as you pray, and watches when you can't. The physical reality of your so-called spouse is distant, abstract, but somehow the expectations are anything but. And here's where things get both deeply spiritual and profoundly weird. Some nuns, especially the mystics, take this spiritual marriage thing very seriously. You've heard whispers about women who have full-blown visions where Christ speaks to them, touches them, even embraces them. Some report feeling a physical presence during prayer. Others claim to have wedded him in dreams that sound, frankly, a little too vivid to be purely theological. One nun in particular, St. Catherine of Siena, reportedly received an invisible wedding ring from Jesus himself, made not of gold, but of his own holy foreskin. Yes, you heard that right. That was a widely circulated claim in the medieval church, and it somehow didn't raise as many eyebrows back then as you'd think. To modern ears, it sounds borderline unhinged, but to medieval believers it was seen as a mark of deep devotion. Catherine claimed she could feel the ring on her finger at all times, even though no one else could see it. Imagine walking around your whole life insisting you're wearing a divine flesh ring, and no one even blinks. This merging of the spiritual and the erotic wasn't accidental. It was almost institutionalized. The idea was that by redirecting every ounce of human longing toward Christ, nuns could transform their desires into divine love. And to be fair, some genuinely seemed to pull that off. They wrote prayers that read like love letters. They whispered his name the way a lover might in the dark. You begin to understand that for many this was the only safe, socially acceptable way to feel passion at all. But for the rest of you, those who don't see visions or feel rings made of holy body parts, it's just confusing. Because you're told you're married to Jesus, but you're also taught to fear your own body. You're encouraged to love him with all your heart, but not with your flesh. And where exactly is the line? Is it okay to imagine him holding you, kissing your forehead? What about your mouth? And if he comes to you in a dream and your body responds, do you confess it? Or does that make you holy? There's no clear answer. Scholars still argue about this. Some insist these experiences were symbolic, nothing more. Others say they were deeply physical. Either way, the tension is real. You see it in how the older nuns pray, bodies stiff, eyes closed, mouths tight with discipline. They want to feel something, clearly, but they're terrified of what that something might be. And so you play the part. You kiss the floor during prayer. You sing the hymns with your voice just loud enough to be heard, just soft enough not to stand out. You pretend that being married to a man you've never touched is enough, that it fills the places inside you that ache, that it makes up for the lack of warmth, of closeness, of anything remotely resembling human affection. But sometimes late at night, you feel something different, something real. It's not a vision, it's not a miracle. It's just a quiet sense of presence, like someone is beside you, listening, breathing. And maybe that's the point. Maybe in the silence and solitude, in the denial and the repetition, you create a space where even longing becomes holy. Still, you can't ignore the irony. The church asks you to love Christ like a bride, but punishes you for feeling what a bride would naturally feel. Passion, affection, physical desire, those are all suspect, even if they're directed at your heavenly husband. It's like being in a relationship where you're not allowed to touch or be touched, but are expected to remain hopelessly in love anyway. Some sisters take this to intense levels. They sleep with thorns under their robes. They fast until their bodies tremble. One nun in your own house wears a chain under her habit, a cold metal reminder to herself that pleasure is the enemy. You asked her about it once and she just said, "He suffered for me. I will suffer for him." You didn't press further, but you noticed the way her hand trembled when she held her rosary. Not from piety, from hunger. And yet, for all the fear and repression, you sometimes glimpse something beautiful in the mess of it all. A sister weeping during Mass, overcome by emotion. The quiet touch of a hand on your back during a particularly difficult morning. A hymn that rises from the group with such harmony, it makes your throat ache. There is love here, deep love. But it's buried under centuries of rules and ritual and fear. You're constantly digging for it, brushing off layers of ash to find a glowing ember underneath. One day you sit alone in the chapel, after everyone else has gone to work. You stare at the crucifix above the altar. You whisper a question you're not even sure you're allowed to ask. Is this what you want? For us to pretend we don't feel? There's no answer, just silence. But for once, it doesn't feel empty. It feels like he heard you. And maybe that's enough. Maybe he's not judging. Maybe he's just waiting. You wake up in the middle of the night, breath shallow, sweat sticky along your spine, heart thudding like you've just run through a thunderstorm. You don't know exactly what the dream was, just that it left you trembling and guilty and aching in ways you're not supposed to name. You glance across the dormitory. The others are asleep, or at least pretending to be. The moonlight filters through the narrow window slits, casting faint silver across the floor like the faintest breath of mercy. You don't move, you just lie there listening to your heartbeat and the steady rhythm of someone else snoring, and you think, what am I supposed to do with this? This is how it starts, really, the slow, uneasy recognition that no matter how devoted you are, your body still insists on participating. It doesn't care that you've taken vows. It doesn't care that the Virgin Mary is watching from 5 different corners of the room in painted form. It doesn't even care that you've tried fasting, silence, cold baths, and guilt. It still wants. And that brings you straight to the dark, awkward territory of the body's betrayal. Dreams, urges, unbidden thoughts. The Church has language for this, nocturnal emission. In men, it's considered unfortunate but manageable. In women, it's often treated with more suspicion, sometimes even horror. After all, a man's body is thought to work automatically. A woman's, according to medieval logic, doesn't do anything without her will involved. So if a nun wakes up wet and shaking, she's not just a victim of sleep. She's a sinner. It doesn't matter that your mind wasn't involved. The mere fact that your body experienced pleasure, unauthorized, unsupervised, and unrepentant, is considered enough to require confession. And so you go. You line up like everyone else, kneeling outside the dark, carved confessional, heart hammering harder than it should for something you technically didn't even do. When it's your turn, you step inside and kneel. You whisper your sin, though sin still feels like the wrong word, and wait. The priest says little. He gives you a penance, tells you to pray for purity, and sends you away. But the shame clings. It always does. Not because he scolded you, but because you don't know how to stop. The medieval church's obsession with bodily purity created a culture of spiritual micromanagement. There were rules for everything, from when and how to bathe, to how many hours you could sleep, to what you were allowed to think about while washing your feet. And yet, despite the mountain of restrictions, nuns still found themselves at war with their own biology. The records don't lie. They're full of anxious questions from women who are terrified that their own nighttime dreams might damn them. In one documented case, a nun wrote in a confession book that she had dreamed of an angel caressing her body. She wasn't sure whether it was demonic temptation or divine comfort. The priest didn't know either. He told her to fast for 3 days and avoid dairy, which is somehow both totally unhelpful and completely on brand for the era. And it wasn't just dreams. There was constant worry over what your body might accidentally cause just by existing. If you were pretty, you were told to be more modest, because beauty tempted others. If you walked with too much grace, you were accused of vanity. If your singing voice drew too much attention during the morning psalms, the abbess might reassign you to kitchen duty for the health of the community. Everything about you had to be dull, muted, unthreatening. You learned to hunch your shoulders slightly, to avoid eye contact, to braid your hair in the simplest way possible. You stop laughing out loud. You fold yourself into a version of piety that's less about holiness and more about avoidance. You shrink until nothing sticks out, except, of course, the dreams. Those refuse to go at, and you're not the only one. One morning, as you help scrub floors with Sister Rosamond, she whispers, "Do you ever have dreams?" You freeze. You wait. She doesn't clarify. She doesn't have to. You just nod very slightly. She doesn't smile. She just sighs, like she's relieved not to be the only one betraying herself at night. The church knew this was happening, of course. There were entire theological debates over whether dreaming of pleasure was as bad as acting on it. Some priests argued that you couldn't sin in your sleep because the will was inactive. Others said that if the dream repeated too often, you were probably encouraging it, whether you knew it or not. And some went full demonology, claiming that succubi, female demons, visited sleeping women and stirred lust in them. Better to blame Satan than biology, apparently. One particularly bonkers fringe belief was that demons could assume the form of saints to trick pious women into ecstatic encounters, which means, according to that logic, your dream about St. Sebastian, looking longingly into your eyes while you lie wrapped in roses, might not be divine. It might just be the devil in drag. So helpful. All this fear made confession less a place of healing and more like a spiritual DMV, a place where you checked in weekly, confessed to existing and hoped your paperwork cleared. The problem was, over time you began to internalise the shame. It wrapped itself around you like a second skin. You began to believe that your own body was a traitor, that pleasure, even accidental, made you unworthy, and the damage didn't stop at night. You started to flinch when someone brushed your arm. You avoided sitting too close. You barely let yourself notice how beautiful Sister Adrienne's voice sounded when she sang the Kyrie. You became afraid not just of sinning, but of wanting to. One evening after Vespers, you sit alone in the cloister garden, the sky turning lavender above you. You wonder what it would be like to live in a body without guilt, to feel something and not immediately search for a penance. The air is cool, a soft wind lifts the edge of your veil. You imagine just for a moment that this is enough, that the dream doesn't need to be punished, that maybe it was just your body reminding you that you're still alive. But you know better. Tomorrow you'll confess again, because that's the system. You sin, you confess, you fast, you repeat, you dream, you wake up afraid, and it goes on and on. You fall asleep that night wondering if God ever gets tired of hearing the same apology from the same lips. Maybe he rolls his eyes. Maybe he reaches down and smooths your hair and says nothing at all. It begins in the stillness, as so many things do here. The chapel is dark, the candles flickering low, and the incense clings to the back of your throat like honey turned sour. You're kneeling, eyes closed, palms open, in imitation of surrender, when suddenly you feel it. Not heat exactly, but a kind of trembling under your skin, like something is trying to rise out of you. Your breath catches, your chest tightens, and just before you can stop it, tears roll silently down your cheeks. You're not sad, you're not scared, you're not even sure what you are. But whatever this is, it doesn't feel like prayer. It feels like something else entirely. This is how it starts for many of the mystics. Quiet moments of devotion that suddenly explode into something much bigger, more intense, and far less controllable. The church has a name for it. Ecstasy. Not the pill, obviously, but the kind of full-body spiritual overload that makes you collapse in a heap of gasping, sweating, weeping devotion. And, depending on who's watching, it's either a miracle or a medical emergency. Some nuns experience it rarely, maybe once in their lives. Others seem to live on the edge of it, eyes glazed, voices dreamy, caught in constant communion with the divine. You're not sure where you fall yet. But it's hard not to notice how much these moments look like something else. Something deeply physical. Something intensely human. Take St. Teresa of Avila, for instance. Her most famous mystical experience involves an angel, a golden spear, and a whole lot of very pointed language. She wrote about being pierced with a dart of love, about how it entered her and left her all on fire with a great love of God. She said the pain was so sweet she never wanted it to end. Medieval theologians called it divine union. Modern readers, well, they've raised more than a few eyebrows. And she wasn't alone. St. Angela of Foligno claimed that during prayer, she could feel Christ lying beside her in bed. She even described wrapping her arms around him, feeling his presence pressed against her body. You read these stories in the library, carefully hidden behind a book of saints' lives. You try not to think about how familiar the language sounds, how close it runs to things you've felt yourself, though never aloud and never with such conviction. You're taught that these visions are sacred, holy, the ultimate reward for perfect devotion. But you can't help but notice how much they resemble the very thing you're told to fear: desire. Physical, overwhelming, breathless desire. Except now it's wrapped in a veil of gold-leaf saints and sung Latin. It's still your body responding, it just has better marketing. And it raises a strange question. If longing for God can feel this intense, this physical, this wet, then where does that leave all the warnings, the guilt, the shame over dreams and glances and idle thoughts? Is there a line between spiritual ecstasy and sexual pleasure, or are they just different flavours of the same hunger? Scholars still argue about this, of course. Some say the mystics were simply using the only language available to describe an experience beyond words, that they reached for metaphors of love and passion because what else could they compare it to? Others argue that these weren't metaphors at all, that the mystics were, in fact, using religious devotion to experience forbidden pleasure in a way the church couldn't punish. It's a debate that's been going on for centuries and no one has come to a clean conclusion. Back in the chapel, you watch Sister Isolde during morning prayer. Her face is flushed. Her lips are parted. She trembles when she sings the final verse of the Magnificat. When it ends, she collapses onto the stone floor like her bones have gone soft. The abbess simply places a hand on her shoulder and whispers something you can't hear. No one asks questions, no one treats it like anything other than a holy experience. But you saw the way her thighs pressed together. You saw the way her fingers curled into fists. Later that day in the scriptorium, you copy out a passage from a mystic's vision. It describes the soul as a bride, being pulled into the embrace of the divine bridegroom, surrounded by light, her breath catching as he enters her heart. You pause, quill hovering. You think, this isn't just metaphor. You finish the page, cheeks hot, trying not to let your mind wander too far. There's a hidden tension here, one no one talks about but everyone seems to understand. Passion is allowed, encouraged even, as long as it's directed at the right object. You can cry, scream, even faint, as long as it's for God. But heaven help you if you feel those things because of another person. Suddenly it's a scandal, a sin, a crisis. The exact same emotional intensity that makes a mystic holy will make a novice dangerous if aimed in the wrong direction. One fringe fact that most outside the cloister don't know: some mystics reported physical wounds after their visions. Not just stigmata, the bleeding hands and feet of Christ, but bruises, marks, even what they described as holy burns on their thighs or chests. Were these psychosomatic, self-inflicted, divine? Again, the scholars can't agree, but the descriptions sound uncomfortably like the aftermath of intense bodily experiences that blur the line between the sacred and the erotic. You think about that the next time you're in prayer and your breath catches for no reason at all. You try to tell yourself it's devotion, that your body is simply reacting to grace. But deep down, you're not entirely convinced, and maybe that's okay. Maybe the body doesn't know the difference, maybe it doesn't care, and that might be the scariest thought of all. Because if you can feel something this powerful, this consuming, without ever breaking a single rule, then what's the point of the rules in the first place? That night, you write a single line in your journal before slipping it back under your mattress. If ecstasy is holy, why does it feel like sin? You don't pray after that, you just lie in bed staring at the rafters and wait for sleep to take you, knowing it probably won't be peaceful, but wondering if maybe that's what makes it real. It's Penance Day again, which means the stone floor in the chapter house is going to get a lot of kneeling action, and you're going to get very familiar with the shape of your own shame. The older nuns file in with the same flat expressions they wear for everything unpleasant, like when the stew is too thin or the candles go out mid-prayer. But you, the younger ones, the novices, you're still new enough to dread it. Not because you think you're innocent. No one here is that naive. But because public penance isn't about cleansing, it's about control. You kneel in the semicircle with the rest of them, eyes on the floor. The abbess enters, her steps slow and deliberate, and reads aloud from the rule, reminding you of your many opportunities to fail. Then she opens the floor. Who among you has sinned in thought, word, or deed? You feel your stomach twist. Someone always steps forward first. Today it's Sister Beatrix. She confesses to pride. Too much joy in completing the altar linens. A safe sin. Classic. The kind of guilt that keeps you in the community's good graces. Then it starts getting heavier. A novice admits to lingering in the garden too long in the company of another. That's code, and everyone knows it. A silence follows, sharp and sudden, and the abbess's mouth tightens, just slightly. The girl is assigned a fast and 6 hours of solitary prayer facing the chapel wall. She's lucky. Last month, a girl caught touching herself during the night watches was forced to wear a sackcloth shift for 2 weeks and eat standing up at the far end of the refectory. No eye contact, no speech. She hasn't smiled since. Penance is a tool of discipline, yes, but it's also strangely theatrical. Everyone's performing, the guilty, the penitent, the stoic. There's a script. You say the right words, you bow low enough, you cry just enough to look sincere, but not so much that it becomes attention-seeking. The abbess decides how real your sorrow is. God, it seems, has outsourced judgment. And let's not even pretend this system isn't soaked in power dynamics. If a priest commits a sin, the worst he gets is reassignment. If a nun is caught holding someone's hand for too long, she might be transferred without warning, or quietly shut in for spiritual reflection, which is just a polite way of saying time out in a cold stone box. That's happened before. Sister Gisela, a warm-hearted woman who hummed while grinding herbs, vanished overnight. No one ever said why. Of course there are degrees. Some penances are symbolic. Extra prayers, more kneeling, fasting. Others get creative. One old punishment involves kneeling on dried peas or stones for an hour, enough time for the pain to settle in your bones. One girl had to scrub the chapel floor with her sleeves for a week after being caught writing a letter to her cousin that was overly affectionate. When asked what exactly was affectionate about it, the abbess simply said, she described his laugh. There's a particular irony in how often punishment dances along the line of sensuality. A whip across the back, a hair shirt that scratches the skin raw, a fast so long your body feels weightless, buzzing, light-headed. These acts are meant to purge desire, but they often wake it instead. You start to notice how your skin reacts to pain, how your breath sharpens with every blow, and then you hate yourself for noticing. You hear stories, quiet ones, passed from older nuns to newer ones, about those who sought penance on purpose, not because they sinned, but because they wanted to feel something, anything. Sister Alodia supposedly asked to be flogged weekly for the sins of the world, but everyone knew she only volunteered when Sister Leonore was the one holding the scourge. She was transferred the next season. There's a real open debate in modern scholarship about whether some forms of medieval penance functioned as an outlet for repressed eroticism. Was all this physical suffering really about God? Or was it the only sanctioned way for women to experience the body, to let themselves feel sensation in a life otherwise wrapped in emotional numbness? Some argue that pain was a form of expression, a bodily language in a world that denied women both voice and choice. Others think that's reading too much into it. But when you've spent 30 hours on your knees with nothing but hunger and bruises for company, you start to have questions of your own. Flagillation was especially popular in some regions. Entire communities of religious women would gather weekly to whip themselves in a circle while chanting psalms. And yeah, that sounds like something from a Dan Brown fever dream, but it was real. There are accounts of nuns collapsing in sobbing heaps afterward, claiming they'd never felt closer to God. Of course, no one ever writes down what happened next, whether they went back to their cells spiritually transformed or just a little more empty. One Fringe case tells of a nun who asked to wear an iron girdle beneath her habit, one with sharp points that pressed into her hips every time she moved. She claimed it helped her stay focused on the Passion of Christ. But you've worn a belt too tight before. You know that kind of pressure leaves more than spiritual impressions. The convent doesn't talk about these things openly, but they don't hide them either. The punishments are public, loud, and designed to remind everyone of what's expected. And somewhere between guilt and fear, the system works. You confess, you accept your punishment, you promise to do better, even if no one really explains what better is. That night, after your own small penance, 10 extra Hail Marys for impatience during silence, you lie awake and stare at the ceiling beams above your cot. Your knees still ache. Your stomach growls. But more than that, there's something hollow inside you, not sadness, not even guilt. Just a kind of ache, that you're not allowed to name. You close your eyes and whisper a prayer, not for forgiveness, but for clarity, for understanding. Because deep down, you're starting to wonder if the real sin isn't feeling too much, but being asked to feel nothing at all. It's late afternoon, and you're elbow deep in a bin of lentils, sorting out the pebbles with hands that don't quite feel like yours anymore. Your mind drifts, as it often does during chores, and you wonder what it would be like to read something dangerous. Not another dry saint's biography or cautionary tale about why it's wrong to love the world, but something that says things. Real things. Secret things. You're not even sure what you mean by that, but you know what you don't mean. Another volume of the edifying life of Saint Eulalia. God, if you have to read one more passage about a woman weeping joyfully while being eaten by lions, you'll start rooting for the lions. The convent library is small, dim, and smells like dust, ink, and centuries of repression, but it holds more than you might expect. Most of it's devotional. Scrolls, codices, some old psalters too fragile to touch. But tucked away, buried behind rows of safely boring theology, are a few books the novices aren't supposed to find, and one afternoon while dusting near the top shelf you do. It doesn't have a title on the spine. The cover is worn calfskin, cracked and soft. You only open it because your fingers are tired of folding linen, and your eyes are hungry for something unexpected. Inside, the Latin is sloppier, faster, like it was written by someone in a hurry, or in hiding. You flip through until you hit a passage that makes your mouth go dry. It's a story, a love story, or maybe something darker. It's about a woman, a nun, who dreams of a radiant man appearing in her chamber. She calls him an angel, he calls her his bride. They speak in riddles, in metaphor, but the meaning is clear enough. He touches her. She burns. She falls to her knees and cries out, not in pain, not even in fear, but in joy. Her whole body becomes a prayer. You slam the book shut. Your heart is thudding. You've never read anything like this. It's not explicit. There's no crude language, no crude drawings tucked into the margins. But it feels explicit. Not just because of what's written, but because of what it stirs. You glance over your shoulder. No one's there. You slide the book back a little too fast and walk out of the library with your hands clenched into fists and your thoughts scattered like spilled ink. You don't sleep that night. That book changes something. Not just the words themselves, but the possibility of them. If that exists, hidden in this place, this world of scrubbed stone and silent rules, then what else has been kept from you? What are the nuns not saying? What have they read, written, done? Over the next few weeks, you start paying attention. You notice which sisters spend the most time in the library, which ones linger too long over the passages, which ones seem to carry a secret weight in their expressions, as if something they read never left them. You want to ask, but how do you start that conversation? Hey, Sister Julianne, do you know of any erotic angel poetry in our archives? It's not exactly a smooth opener, and so you watch, you listen, and slowly you begin to realise that the books are just the surface. There's a whole undercurrent here, quiet, forbidden, and very much alive. Notes passed between novices in Latin, with double meanings buried beneath pious lines. Marginalia scribbled in devotional texts that make you raise your eyebrows. And once, in the bottom of an old wooden chest, you find a crumpled piece of parchment that simply reads, "He entered me like the breath of God." You don't know who wrote it, but you know they understood something you're only beginning to. This is the Forbidden Library. Not a place, really, but an idea. A network of words and whispers and shared glances that make the whole convent feel less like a fortress and more like a hive. Not everyone's part of it. Some sisters are as rigid and joyless as the rule itself, but others, you see them differently now. Their silences aren't empty, they're loaded. There's a debate among historians about how widespread this kind of secret knowledge was. Some believe that most convents were sterile environments where books were heavily monitored and any deviation was crushed. Others argue that women, particularly literate women in cloistered life, often used writing as an emotional escape hatch. That buried beneath the surface of all those copied psalms and saintly memoirs were fragments of longing, of rebellion, a quiet intimacy that couldn't be spoken aloud. And yes, there's a whole corner of medieval scholarship devoted to the feminine mystic voice, analysing how women encoded forbidden feelings into their theological work. You think about that often now, about what might be hiding behind every prayer, what every "I long for thee, O Lord" might actually mean. One quirky little fact, some convents kept locked cabinets for questionable material. Books that weren't banned outright, but required special permission to access. You imagine a sign on the front, "Only read if your soul can handle it." And you wonder if anyone ever said, "Actually, my soul's already a little singed, might as well go for broke." You spend more and more time in the library now, pretending to study scripture while hunting for the next secret. Your fingers trace bindings like they're skin. Your eyes scan lines faster than your mind can keep up. And sometimes, rarely, you find something. A sentence, a phrase, even just a metaphor that lands wrong in the best way. And when you do, it feels like the world tips just slightly, like gravity shifts. You're not alone in your hunger. You never were. You wonder if the abbess knows. You suspect she does. She has that look, tight-lipped, calm but watchful, like someone who's seen this cycle before. A young nun discovers something forbidden, reads too much, feels too much, maybe confesses, maybe doesn't. Eventually, either she breaks, or she buries it deep enough to keep functioning. You haven't decided which path you're on yet, but you know one thing for certain. Once you've tasted words like those, you can't go back to linen and lentils without part of you aching for something more. That night you lie in your cot, eyes open, repeating one line over and over like a prayer. "He entered me like the breath of God." And the worst part? You still don't know if that line is sacred or just true. At some point, you stop pretending you don't notice the way she looks at you. It starts off small. Sister Celeste brushing your sleeve when passing in the refectory, standing a little too close during morning chores, her voice dropping to a whisper when she speaks your name. You tell yourself it's nothing. It has to be nothing. But deep down, something begins to shift in your chest, soft and dangerous. She's not the first nun you've admired, but admiration isn't what this is. Celeste is sharp-witted and strangely kind, always managing to say something warm without ever stepping outside the bounds of obedience. But when her hand rests on your back during silent prayer, even for a send, it burns through your habit like sunlight on frost. And the worst part is, she knows what that touch does, and you don't stop her. You're careful, of course, everyone is. There are too many eyes in a place like this, too many rules wrapped in pious language. But between prayers and penance, there's always a sliver of time, just enough for a glance to linger, for a word to slip between lines of scripture, for a breath shared in the darkness of the vestry when no one else is watching. And you learn quickly that there are ways to be close without breaking a single rule. The church might own your body, but it doesn't own your thoughts. It doesn't own the warmth that spreads across your chest when Celeste laughs, or the way her fingers linger on yours when handing you a psalter. It doesn't control the heat in your throat when you catch her humming the same hymn you had whispered the night before. It doesn't know how to police that. Yet, desire in the convent is a quiet, clever thing. It has to be. It finds its way into service, into care. You comb her hair after evening prayers, your hands slow and reverent. She braids yours the next day. No one says anything, no one has to. These are simple acts of charity, of course, compassion between sisters. The rule doesn't forbid brushing someone's hair, but the rule also didn't anticipate the way she presses her palm against your neck as if trying to memorize the shape of your pulse. There's a common idea outside these walls that nuns were either saints or prisoners, that they spent their lives alone, untouched by worshipping a god who mostly ignored them. But that's a lie built on ignorance and fantasy. The truth is messier. The truth is that in places where the outside world falls away, people find new ways to be human. Ways that don't always make sense or follow the rules. Ways that are quiet enough to survive. Medieval records, what few remain, show that relationships like this were not rare. Court cases survive from inquisitions and episcopal investigations, stories of nuns who are found to be too affectionate, overly familiar, or guilty of unnatural acts. The language is vague on purpose, but everyone knows what it means. And while some of those cases led to expulsion or worse, many just faded into silence. The church didn't always know what to do with these women. They weren't heretics, they weren't witches, they were just too close. One especially famous case from a convent in France describes two nuns caught kissing behind the cloister wall. They were punished with a week of silence and extra fasting, not because of the act itself, but because they were seen. The shame wasn't in the desire, it was in the exposure, as if sin only mattered once it had an audience. And there's the heart of it. In here, sin is rarely about what is, it's about what looks like. You can feel what you want as long as you never show it. You can love someone as long as no one sees you love them. You can brush her fingers in the dark, lean close enough to feel her breath, whisper her name into your pillow. But if you're caught, that love becomes a crime. And still you keep doing it. Not everything you feel is romantic or sexual, but some of it is. And the fact that it's another woman, well, that just makes it more invisible. In a world that barely believes women have desire at all, how could anyone imagine two of them would share it? You learn to write around the truth, to tuck little notes into the pages of her prayer book, just single lines, never names, nothing that could be traced. He is with us in the stillness. Even the silent ones feel the fire. I dreamed of you in white. She always writes back, never directly, but the psalter is always returned with a fresh line added, something soft and cryptic that sets your skin tingling for the rest of the day. There's no language for what you are to each other. Not in the church, not in the rule, not even in the books you read late at night. But you find your own. You call her my soul's echo. She calls you sister in sight. It sounds spiritual enough to pass, but when she says it, sembaios, you hear something else, something hungry. The church would call this unnatural, a sin of the flesh. But what you have with her feels more natural than anything else in this cold stone life. It's the only thing that doesn't feel like performance. You don't pretend with her. Not when you kneel side by side at Mass. Not when your hands brush under the altar cloth. Not when your eyes lock during sung prayer, and both your voices falter for just a moment. There's a modern debate, quiet and ongoing, about how to read these relationships. Were they romantic, sexual, platonic, sisterly? Some historians insist we're projecting modern ideas onto past lives. Others argue that intimacy is intimacy, regardless of era. But inside this world, those distinctions blur. What you feel for Celeste isn't modern or historical. It just is. A slow-burning, quiet flashing flame in a room that was never meant to hold fire. You're careful, always, but you don't stop, you can't. And maybe that's the real rebellion. Not the touch or the notes or the closeness, but the refusal to apologise for wanting something real in a world built entirely on denial. One night you sit beside her in the chapel, the candles almost burn down to wax puddles, and she leans just slightly, so her shoulder brushes yours. Neither of you speaks. Neither of you moves, and you both know it. This moment, this closeness, this tiny, defiant stillness is a prayer far more honest than any you've ever spoken aloud. You sit alone in the confessional, knees bruising against the cold wood, heart pounding loud enough to drown out your thoughts. Behind the grill, a priest's voice murmurs something routine, Dominus vobiscum, but you don't answer right away. You're stalling. This time you don't know how to start. The weight of the silence presses down, filling the tiny box with more heat than the stone chapel ever holds. When you finally speak, your voice comes out thinner than you meant. You confess that your thoughts have been unsettled. You confess that you've felt affection too deeply, that your body has responded without permission. You do not say her name, you do not admit the shape of the truth. The priest, as always, gives you nothing. No pause, no gasp of scandal. Just a string of paternosters and an order to fast again. You nod, you whisper thank you, Father, and slip out into the chapel with your guilt neatly folded back into your habit. But something about the exchange leaves you colder than usual. His voice was softer than before, almost familiar. That's the thing about priests here. They're everywhere and nowhere. They administer the sacraments, preach during feast days and offer confession, but they live separately, at least officially. But of course, boundaries in theory don't always hold up in practice. You've noticed the way some priests look at the younger nuns. You've noticed how quickly certain sisters rush to confession after only a day or two. And you've heard the stories, softly whispered in kitchens, in corners, in laundry rooms, about what really happens behind the curtain. Everyone pretends it doesn't happen, that priests are too holy, too distant, too disinterested. But that's just wishful thinking layered with power. The truth is, some of them take full advantage of the secrecy and trust baked into the role. Confession becomes a place not for absolution, but for manipulation. Questions become too personal. The line between spiritual guidance and something darker gets blurry fast, and no one ever talks about it unless someone gets caught, which more often than not only happens when a pregnancy appears. The church has always struggled to discipline its own. Priests caught in inappropriate relations with nuns were sometimes relocated quietly, or given penance. Rarely were they punished as severely as the women involved. The double standard is blatant but predictable. You've seen the way power bends in this place. You're not surprised anymore, just tired. One of the older sisters, Sister Hiltrude, once let it slip that the convent nearly lost its charter 50 years ago, after a scandal involving the visiting confessor and 3 nuns. The records say the women seduced him. You know how that story goes. One was sent to another house, one was quietly cloistered, and the third vanished entirely. The priest, from what little anyone can recall, was reassigned to a rural parish. End of story. And then, of course, there's the grey area. The places where nothing physical happens, but the atmosphere turns thick with implication. You've experienced it yourself. A priest holding your gaze too long during the Eucharist. A hand resting too firmly on your shoulder. A question asked in confession that didn't feel like it came from concern. You walked away shaken, but what would you even say? He didn't do anything, not technically, and that's exactly the point. There are rare cases where it was more than implication. Inquisitorial records, some preserved in Latin so flowery it's like reading a romance novel dictated by Satan, detail incidents where priests and nuns met repeatedly in secret. Sometimes it was for months, sometimes years. Sometimes it was framed as spiritual direction. Sometimes it was just lust with a prayerful disguise. One nun, when confronted, claimed she'd been told it was part of her penance, that he'd instructed her to offer her body as a sacrifice. She wasn't believed, of course. She was condemned. He was sent away with his reputation intact. You think about that when you kneel next to Sister Celeste during morning prayer. You can feel her beside you, the quiet thrum of her presence as loud to you as any chant. You think about what would happen if someone saw the way you look at each other. You think about how it would be your sin, not hers, not his, yours. And it makes you wonder, why is it always the woman's guilt that becomes the headline? There's a fringe belief that's never made it into the official theology, but it survives in the corners, in the whispers between tired nuns peeling root vegetables and folding altar linens. It says that the devil doesn't just tempt men and women differently, he tempts them through each other. That the man is corrupted through pride, but the woman is corrupted through desire. And since desire is more visible, more dangerous, it must be punished first. After all, the serpent spoke to Eve, not Adam. It's convenient, really. Because it means you can blame the woman without ever looking at the man. Sometimes you wonder what kind of power that gives priests, not just over your spiritual life, but over your body. You're supposed to bare your soul to them, tell them every impure thought, every moment of weakness, and in return they get to stay behind the screen, untouched, untouchable. But you've seen what happens when the screen isn't enough, when the curtain parts, when confession becomes something else. One priest, Father Anselm, visits every 3rd week. He speaks softly, his sermons tight and composed, his eyes unreadable. He's never been unkind, but you feel something when he's near. A pressure, like standing too close to a fire that hasn't been lit yet. Once in confession, he asked you if you felt a special nearness to the Lord. His tone was gentle, but his meaning bent. You nodded, careful. You didn't return. Some nuns form attachments, not out of seduction, but out of desperation. A man's attention in a sea of silence and sameness can feel like mercy. You don't blame them, you just fear what happens when the longing outpaces the rules. You've stopped going to confession weekly. You make excuses, work, prayer for sore throat. The abbess hasn't pressed you yet, but she will, she always does. Eventually, every nun has to answer to someone. That night, you sit in the chapel after compline, the last prayers of the day echoing faintly in your memory. You stare at the altar, where the candles burn like small sentinels. You wonder if God hears everything you whisper behind the curtain. You wonder if he knows the difference between a sin and a secret, between a confession and a confession taken. You close your eyes, fold your hands, and murmur the only prayer that feels true. Please, let me still belong to myself, because in this place sometimes that's the only thing worth saving. It starts with a rumour, the way everything starts here. You hear it during laundry, passed like a prayer between folded sleeves and soap-stung fingers. Someone saw 2 sisters disappear behind the vestry door after none. Someone else swears they heard giggling. Another claims she saw the abbess's expression tighten during evening prayers, just for a moment, like she'd already heard more than enough. You pretend not to listen, but you're listening. Everyone listens. Gossip in the convent isn't just customary, it's survival. Information is currency, power warning, especially when scandal is involved. Within a day it has a name, Sister Benicia, and someone else. No one's sure who, but that's how these things go. They spread fast and wide, and the details shift with each telling like wind stirring ash. One version says it was a kiss. Another, a letter found under a mattress. One girl swears it was full-blown fornication under the statue of St. Clair, though even she doesn't seem to believe it. You think of Benicia, sharp-tongued, always laughing with her teeth, more alive than most of the ghosts in habits around here. She once winked at you after morning mass just because she caught you dozing. You remember the flicker of amusement in her eyes, how it stayed with you all day. Now you wonder if that spark burned a little too hot. 2 days later, she's gone. No explanation, no formal penance, no chance to say goodbye. Her bed is stripped, her books gone, her name scratched off the duty roster like it was never written. The abbess doesn't mention her. No one does. But the silence left in her place screams at you during every meal, every prayer, every sleepless hour. This isn't the first time, of course. The church has long had protocols for such incidents. When scandal blooms, you don't investigate. You contain. Convents were both spiritual sanctuaries and, frankly, reputational landmines. If word got out that women vowed to chastity were touching each other, or worse, enjoying it wasn't just a moral issue, it was a political one. Funding, patronage, legitimacy, all of it hung in the balance. So when things went sideways, they went quietly. Historical records show dozens of these silent scandals. A 14th century English convent saw 4 sisters sent away in the middle of the winter after a bishop's visit exposed a network of corruption. The phrase was vague, but court testimony described letters filled with longing and bodies curled together under shared blankets. In another case in Italy, a group of women were interrogated for having a secret affection circle where they exchanged poems and touched hands during Vespers. Only one returned. The rest were absorbed into different houses, like drops of ink in too much water. Inquisition records, for all their cruelty, offer eerie insight. You find one in a dusty volume from the restricted shelf describing an event at a convent outside Cologne. 2 nuns, Sister Gertrude and Sister Alwine, were accused not just of touching but of worshipping each other's bodies as they might the wounds of Christ. It's hard to tell if the words were confessions or just interpretations, because when men write down women's sins, they rarely leave space for what the women themselves meant. And that's the part that sticks with you, the interpretation. Because maybe Sister Benicia did kiss someone, maybe she didn't. But in the end, it's not about what happened. It's about what someone saw, or thought they saw, or imagined in the dark. It's about control and what the church does to women who dare to live outside the script. The abbess says nothing. Her silence is louder than any punishment. She tightens the curfew, cuts back recreation hours, reassigns dormitories without explanation. You're moved to a new cell, closer to the older nuns. You're not the only one. Suddenly everyone's being watched. The air is sharp with suspicion. Glances are weighed. Conversations go quiet when someone else enters the room. The message is clear. We saw what happened. It will not happen again. You find yourself grieving, not just for Benicia, but for what her absence means. You didn't love her, but she represented something you'd barely dared to hope for, a kind of freedom within the chains, a flash of laughter in a world that prefers silence. And now she's gone, swallowed by a system that knows exactly how to erase you without leaving a mark. You and Sister Celeste don't speak for 3 days, not out of fear, out of mourning. The shared silence between you is heavier than words. On the 4th day, you pass her in the cloister, and she brushes her fingers along yours. Barely a touch, but enough to say, I'm still here. You nod and you walk on, but you feel the burn of that touch all evening. There's an unspoken law in convents, don't get caught. Not just for your own sake, but for hers. 1 scandal is a tragedy. 2 is a pattern, and patterns get punished more thoroughly. You know that now, you've seen it. Still, there's a question you can't shake. Was Benicia's sin a moment of weakness, or a moment of truth? And is it really better to go quietly, untouched, unloved, unscathed, than to burn just once with something real? Modern scholars often debate this exact thing. Whether these sandals were moments of actual rebellion, or just the church's projection of fear onto any visible affection between women. There are those who argue these were romantic friendships, nothing more. Others insist the language of the records, the focus on physicality, the poetic confessions, suggest deeper relationships, hidden by necessity and punished by design. You suspect the truth is both, that love happened here, that desire slipped through cracks in the walls, and that sometimes someone got caught holding the flame too high. That night you return to the chapel after everyone's gone. You kneel alone. You light a candle for Sister Benicia. You don't say a name. You just whisper, "You mattered." And as the flame flickers, you feel a strange peace settle over your shoulders. Not because the rules are fair, but because somewhere in the silence someone dared to break them. You can't look away from her stomach. Sister Magdala, older than most of the novices but not quite middle-aged, has always been quiet, devout and politely forgettable. But lately, there's a change. Subtle, but impossible to unsee once you do. Her hands linger over her robes. She's slower during chores. She breathes with effort after climbing stairs, and her face, once sharp with fasts and sleep deprivation, is rounder now. Softer. It happens gradually, the way all things do here. First the whispers, then the suspicious glances, then someone, likely one of the overzealous younger sisters, tells the abbess. And that's when it becomes official. Oh, there's a problem. Not a health issue, not a crisis. A problem. Because Sister Magdala is pregnant. No. You hear about it first through a barely audible conversation in the infirmary hallway, one of the older nuns hissing to another, "It's a scandal, she's shamed the whole house." And then the door closes. And that's it. The matter, like all unclean things, is sealed behind wooden prayer. The church has always had a complicated relationship with the idea of pregnant nuns. In theory it's impossible. These women are supposed to be virgins, married to Christ, immune to desire. But history says otherwise. Records across Europe tell of convents where pregnancies occurred, often explained with a shrug and a finger pointed at the devil, or rape, or occasionally the miraculous. One nun, centuries ago, claimed she had been visited by the Holy Spirit in a dream. Another swore that her pregnancy resulted from eating apples with impure intent. You laugh at that one until you realise it's an actual entry in an ecclesiastical hearing. You wish you were joking. No one talks to Magdala after the truth comes out. Not directly. She's confined to a small chamber behind the infirmary. She still prays, still sings when she's allowed in the chapel, but she doesn't meet anyone's eyes. Not anymore. You catch sight of her once, moving slowly through the cloister, her veil pinned tightly around her face, hands folded high above the curve of her belly. She looks like a painting, a Madonna without the glory. You want to speak to her, you want to ask how, who, why, but you don't. Because to ask is to risk knowing, and knowledge in a place like this is a liability. Speculation fills the silence. Some say it was a visiting monk. Others say it was a stable boy who used to bring deliveries before the convent closed the gates for Lent. A few whisper that she did it on purpose, that she wanted to be caught, that she'd grown tired of silence and cold and endless ritual and thought, why not? But no one knows. Not really, because Magdala doesn't speak. Historically, her silence would have been a survival strategy. Pregnant nuns were often treated less as fallen women and more as walking indictments of clerical hypocrisy. If she names a priest, that creates waves. If she names a peasant, that's scandalous but manageable. If she says nothing, they can quietly remove her, reassign her shea, pretend it never happened. In some cases, pregnant nuns were imprisoned or sent to do lifelong penance in isolation. One record from a 13th century Spanish convent details a nun who gave birth in the dead of winter and buried the child under a fig tree. She was caught. They walled her into a tiny cell attached to the chapel, where she was given food through a slot in the wall. She lived for 18 more years. You try not to think about that when you pass Magdala's chamber again, but it sticks in your mind, clinging like smoke. What will they do to her? What will become of the child? You don't have to wait long to find out. One morning before matins, the bell tolls twice, an unusual pattern. It's the signal for a quiet procession. The older nuns dress quickly, lips pressed tight. You follow them, pulse hammering, until you reach the infirmary. There, Sister Magdala lies still, a tiny swaddled form beside her bed. The child didn't live. The birth came too early or too fast. No one says. No one explains. Magdala herself is pale, breathing shallowly. The abbess blesses the child and orders its burial in the garden's far corner. Unmarked, as all forbidden things must be. No mother is allowed to grieve. No grave is allowed to remember. The abbess leads a prayer over Magdala's bed, her words stiff with formality. May the Lord forgive the errors of the flesh and welcome this soul into purity once more. And then she says nothing else. Nothing personal, nothing kind. Magdala doesn't cry, she doesn't even blink. She just turns her head to the wall and says in a whisper so soft it barely reaches you, it was not a sin to want. That line stays with you. It follows you through prayers, through meals, through the moments of silence when your thoughts turn inward. It echoes through your bones when you lie awake at night, pressed against your own belly, wondering if your body is as unpredictable, as dangerous as hers. Because that's what this place teaches you, over and over again, that your body is not to be trusted. It's a trap, a liability, a doorway for temptation and shame. But Magdala's words crack something open. It was not a sin to want. Maybe she's right. Maybe the real sin is pretending your body isn't capable of longing, of pleasure, of rebellion. Maybe the real sin is in the silence they forced her into, in the burial with no name, in the prayers that feel more like judgments. That night you light a candle in the chapel after Compline, long after everyone else has gone to sleep. You kneel alone and whisper her name, just once, just to say it, just to remember. Sister Magdala. She wanted something more. She took it, and she paid the price. You wonder how many others have, how many have walked this same path in shadow, how many lit candles that no one ever saw. And then, even though no one told you to, you say a prayer for the child. Because if no one else will remember them, you will. You sit beside Sister Agnes during supper, your bowls of watery leek broth steaming faintly under the flickering wall sconces, and everything feels normal until it doesn't. She laughs at something you say, a real laugh, sharp and sudden, and the sound travels down your spine like heat. Then she places her hand over yours for just a second too long, before remembering where you are, who you are. She retracts it quietly, gently, like a feather being pulled back by wind. And you feel something catch in your throat. Not guilt, not fear, but that raw shimmer of recognition. You're not alone. You've seen the same look in other nuns' eyes. In the way Sister Celeste watches you pray. In the way Sister Leonie moves through the cloister with such care. Her eyes always alert. Her body held tightly inward as though someone might read the shape of her thoughts if she walks too freely. There's a thread, invisible but undeniable, that connects you all. You don't talk about it, but you know. You know. You've been told that this kind of love doesn't exist here. That whatever you feel is unnatural, a temptation, a distraction from divine purity. But your body has other ideas. So does your heart. So do your dreams, and so does history, though it's been swept clean of the details, buried beneath 1,000 glowing hagiographies. The Church never had good language for what you're feeling. There are words for sin, for chastity, for disobedience. There are words for pride, envy, and even for gluttony. But for this, for two women reaching for one another in some ways in terror, in need, the closest word they ever found was unnatural affection, which tells you everything about who got to write the rules. You stumble across an old volume in the library, Dialogues of the Cloister, anonymous, probably 15th century. Tucked between dry arguments about discipline and dietary order is a small section titled De Amicitia Feminarum, on the friendship of women. It speaks of the sweetness of sisterly affection, of souls knit together in the service of God. But between the lines you hear something else, something warmer. One passage describes two sisters who clung together with a tenderness that no rebuke could undo. Another, more daring, notes that their hearts moved in harmony, and their silence was more intimate than speech. You memorize those lines, you whisper them when you're alone. You don't need the book anymore. There's a real scholarly debate now about how to interpret all this. Were these just holy friendships, as the Church insisted? Or was the language Sundi used to mask emotional and physical intimacy between women who had no other vocabulary for what they were? Some researchers argue that same-sex relationships in convents were more widespread than previously acknowledged, often tolerated as long as they remained discreet. Others cling to the idea that these bonds were spiritual, nothing more. But you don't need an academic consensus. You live the tension, you breathe it, and sometimes you feel it in your skin. It starts as closeness, a brush of arms during chores, whispered laughter behind a book, a shared blanket on cold winter nights. Nothing that can be punished, nothing that can be proven, but it builds, it always builds. One night you find yourself alone with Agnes in the sacristy, you're refolding linens. She's humming softly, a melody you both know. The air is thick with candle wax and old incense. And then slowly, carefully, she reaches up and tucks a strand of hair behind your ear. Her fingers linger. Her eyes hold yours. You don't move. She leans closer, so close you can smell the faint hint of lavender oil from her shift. And then she pulls away, just before anything happens, just before something could. You both freeze. The moment is heavy, trembling with a could have and almost did. Then she whispers, "Forgive me," and leaves. You stand there for a long time, hands gripping the edge of the linen table, heart thudding so hard it makes your vision blur. Later in your cell you write her name in the corner of your prayer book. Not the full name, just a single letter. A. And next to it a phrase, "More than sister." You stare at it until the candle burns low. There's a story from 13th century Saxony about two nuns who were separated after a new abbess took charge, and declared their bond a danger to the moral fabric of the house. The letters they wrote to one another survive, barely. Faded, translated, recopied. They are not confessions, they are not apologies. They are love letters, full of longing, of memory, of defiance. "I remember your hands in winter," one wrote. "You were warmer than any fire." You read that line 12 times, 100, until you can taste it. And yet, for every tender story like that, there's a darker one. Nuns denounced by jealous sisters, forced coercions, whispers to visiting bishops, Inquisition records that detail mutual violation between women who lived and prayed together for years. The records always paint them as sinners, rarely as lovers, never as women who found comfort in each other's arms when the world had given them none. You know the risks, you know how easy it would be to fall, to break the fragile shell of rules that keep you from being punished. But every time Agnes glances your way, every time she smiles like she knows exactly how much you're holding in, you ask yourself, what if it's worth it? Maybe it's not about falling, maybe it's about choosing. You see her again in the garden the next morning. Dew clings to her lashes. She doesn't speak. She just passes you a folded scrap of parchment as if it's nothing. You open it in secret later. 4 words, nothing more. "You are my prayer," and you weep silently that night. Not from guilt, but from how deeply those words filled something hollow inside you. Because even here, even now, love still finds its way through stone and silence. You hear the story third hand, which is the most dangerous kind of truth in a place like this. It slips through conversations, twisted and softened, until it barely resembles what actually happened, if it ever really did. But the bones of it stay the same. A man, a disguise, a woman's chamber in the middle of the night, and a habit that wasn't worn with the right kind of reverence. It starts with a door left ajar, so the story goes. A sister returning late from the stables sees a figure slipping through the courtyard, hunched and cloaked, moving like someone with too much purpose for midnight. She assumes it's one of the older nuns checking on livestock. But the next day, Sister Mariette is pale, dazed, and won't meet anyone's eyes. A week later, she's gone. You put the pieces together on your own. You've seen it in the records. You've read enough court cases, carefully translated and half-censored, to recognise the pattern. Every so often, someone from outside the convent finds a way in, and not just metaphorically. It sounds impossible at first. These walls are thick, the gates are locked. The convent is a fortress, but stone doesn't hold back desperation, or lust, or love, depending on how you want to spin it. There are ways in, secret tunnels left over from older construction, bribes paid to night watchmen, habits sewn by unobservant hands and worn by the wrong bodies. The men come in cloaked in darkness and conviction. They leave behind silence, shame, sometimes children, always questions. There's one notorious case from 14th century Bologna where a man disguised himself as a nun for 6 months before being discovered. His name was never recorded, erased perhaps to preserve someone's dignity, but he managed to integrate into the daily life of the convent. Prayed, sang, worked in the kitchen, slept among the sisters. When he was finally caught, the official charge was violating the sanctity of God's house. The unspoken charge was something far less poetic. No one talks about how many women were punished for letting him stay hidden. Here in your own cloister, there are whispered rumours of similar things. A stable boy who lingered too long near the laundry. A young man who fell in love with a sister and disguised himself to see her during night prayers. Some say he climbed the garden wall dressed in a spare habit. Others say he was smuggled in under a wagon load of linens. The story changes depending on who tells it. But the ending's always the same. Exposure, scandal, exile. For her at least. What drives someone to risk that much, you wonder? What kind of hunger must crack through vows, walls, oaths and fear? You'd like to believe it's love, that somewhere someone couldn't bear to be apart from the one they adored. But the more you hear, the more it sounds like possession. Desire without consequences, at least not for the man. Sister Elodie says nothing, but you see it in her face when the story spreads. She looks haunted. She walks with her head down. And then, one morning, she doesn't come to prayers. You find out later she's been sent away for healing. That's the church's favourite euphemism when a woman knows too much. And it's not just men sneaking in. Occasionally, they come with permission. Priests, scholars, scribes, even bishops, all invited into spaces meant to be sealed. They move through the halls like they belong, like the rules aren't written for them. And the sisters are told to be polite, obedient, humble. It's impossible not to notice how much attention some men give the prettier novices, how they linger too long with praise for their Latin, how they offer to guide their spiritual growth. Sometimes a man doesn't need to sneak in, he's already here. It's one of the things you don't learn from the rule of St. Benedict, or from the Psalms, or from the stern warnings during your early novitiate. That power doesn't knock. It just walks through the door, and sometimes it wears a habit. There's another story, older, more legend than fact, about a nun in 13th century France who discovered that her closest friend, another sister, devout and reserved, was actually a man in hiding. Some versions claim he took refuge in the convent to escape conscription. Others say he joined for love. Either way, they lived as nuns for years. When he was discovered, the convent begged the bishop to spare them both. He refused. She was exiled. He disappeared. No one knows what became of them. You think about what it would feel like to pray beside someone, day after day, only to realise they were never who they claimed. Would you feel betrayed or jealous that he found a way to live among women, to feel closeness, to experience safety, however false? And then, of course, there's the darker interpretation, that the disguise wasn't about love, that it was about access, that behind every romantic tale is a shadow of violation. Modern scholars still argue about these stories. Some treat them as sensationalist fiction, written to feed the church's paranoia about the dangers of female autonomy. Others believe they were real, and that the obsession with them reveals more about male anxiety than female sin. You can't say which is more frightening, the idea that these men existed, or the idea that they didn't, and yet their stories were used to punish women anyway. Because in the end, the impact is the same. Fear, division, more locks and more locked on the doors, more eyes watching, more silence. You wonder if Sister Mariette ever knew his name, if he told her he loved her, if he asked, or if she just woke up one morning to find herself ruined, the door swinging open behind him. You wonder what he got to keep when he walked away, his body, his freedom, his anonymity. You wonder what she had to lose. And you know, deep down, it was everything. That night you double knot the cord around your waist and lie facing the wall. You don't pray, you don't sleep. You just breathe slowly, quietly, as though someone might be listening. Because sometimes it feels like there's always someone listening. It's almost funny in a way that doesn't make you laugh. The outside world seems to imagine that nuns are either saints or seductresses. Pure virgins with downcast eyes or secret sinners wrapped in veils, their mouths full of prayers they barely mean. And nowhere is that more obvious than in the artwork. You've seen the way they paint you. In some depictions, nuns are so ethereal they barely look alive. Pale skin, hands clasped, eyes raised in rapture like they're always half a breath away from heaven. In others, the edges of the canvas blur, and suddenly a breast is exposed by accident, or a robe clings too tightly to the curves the artist swears he wasn't emphasizing. The intention is always the same, to make you desirable or to prove you never were. Rarely anything in between. You're in the scriptorium when you first see the marginalia, those tiny mischievous drawings crammed into the borders of otherwise holy texts. You're supposed to be copying psalms, but your eyes drift to the corner, where a crude little ink figure has been scrawled beneath the line, "Blessed are the pure of heart." The figure is clearly a nun, and she's clearly doing something that would earn you 3 days of silent meals and at least one night sleeping on the chapel floor. You feel your cheeks burn, not from shock but from recognition. The artist, some long-dead monk with too much time and a twisted sense of humour, drew dozens of these in the same manuscript. Nuns kissing, nuns kneeling before each other, in poses that have nothing to do with prayer. Nuns being tempted by demons shaped like men. Nuns in ecstasy, mouths open, limbs tangled. It's part satire, part fantasy, part warning. And all of it feels so familiar, like a mirror held just slightly too close to the truth. You wonder who he was drawing from, who he was imagining. It's not just in the margins. You find it in the stained glass too. Those gaudy depictions of female saints pierced by arrows, struck down by swords, always in flowing robes that somehow manage to fall just right, exposing skin that has no business being exposed mid-martyrdom. The worst ones are the passion scenes. Christ on the cross surrounded by weeping nuns, their tears painted so lovingly they might as well be sweat. One artist in the nearby abbey was famous for the way he painted the Virgin Mary, always looking slightly flushed, as if the Annunciation was something she felt. The problem isn't just that the art is sexual, it's that it insists you are, that you exist as a temptation, a symbol, a body that means more than it is, that your holiness is somehow always suspect because you're a woman. The theologians were no better. You've read the sermons, you've copied them in fact. Bernard of Clairvaux once wrote that nuns must be careful not to become stumbling blocks for their brethren, as if your very existence is a hazard, as if your silence is seductive, your obedience alluring, even your prayers, if offered with too much emotion, risk turning the chapel into a den of lust. It would be easier to laugh if it didn't bleed into how you're treated. You notice it in the way visiting monks avoid eye contact with the younger sisters, or how a priest won't hear confession in person, but insists on a veil between you, for your modesty. You can feel it in the abbess's warnings too, not spoken but implied. Wear your veil low, keep your hands folded, don't look too long at anyone, don't smile unless you mean it piously. Even joy can be misread as invitation. And yet somehow you're also expected to love, to be tender, to offer warmth and compassion. You are Christ's bride after all, so you must be open but not too open, kind but not inviting, humble but not flirtatious. It's like walking a tightrope in the dark while someone below shouts, "Don't fall or we'll say you jumped." You remember a particular painting shown to you during a guest lecture from a travelling friar. It depicted a nun kneeling before Christ, her face upturned, mouth open, as a beam of divine light pierced her chest. The friar called it an image of spiritual longing. You looked at it and felt your stomach twist. You've seen that expression before, in the chapel, in yourself, in moments too private to name. That wasn't longing. That was desire. There's a whole corner of art history that wrestles with this exact confusion. They call it sacred eroticism, a genre in which religious ecstasy and physical pleasure become indistinguishable. Female saints swoon under the weight of holy love. Their bodies twist, their lips part, the scenes blur the line between adoration and arousal. Were the artists trying to capture divine mystery? Or just projecting their fantasies onto women who couldn't talk back? It's not just about the viewer, it's about the system. The church has always feared female holiness when it looks too much like power. And nothing is more powerful, more unsettling than a woman who knows herself, her desires, her limits, her worth, and refuses to apologise for any of it. That's why the seductress nun is such a persistent myth. She's not real. She's a warning, a symbol, a story told to scare you into staying small. And it works. You catch yourself pulling your veil tighter when walking near the courtyard, lowering your gaze when speaking to male visitors, dulling your voice during hymns. You don't want to be a symbol, you just want to be a person. But then you see Sister Agnes in the candlelight, or feel the pressure of Celeste's fingers brushing yours, or remember Sister Magdala's whisper, "It was not a sin to want," and you think, maybe they're afraid for a reason, because if women like you ever stopped whispering and started speaking, if you ever named what you felt and refused to flinch, you might just burn this whole mythology to the ground. That night you take a page of old parchment and draw something of your own. A figure kneeling, eyes closed, not in shame but in pleasure. Not being punished, not weeping, just being. You hide it under your mattress when you're done. You don't want anyone to find it. You also hope that someday someone will. You finally find her voice, not in the chapel or the cloister, not even in whispered stories passed between beds at night, but in a letter. A real one, handwritten in pale brown ink, the parchment curling at the edges like it's been hiding for centuries. You stumble across it folded into the back cover of an old devotional manual on St. Lucy, of all things, tucked there like a pressed flower, or a secret never meant to bloom. It's unsigned, but it's written in a woman's hand, delicate yet firm. The Latin is precise, personal, and strangely intimate. It's not a confession, not quite a prayer, but something in between, something soft, aching, unfinished. You read it once, quickly, eyes skimming over lines that feel too private to touch. Then again, slower, letting each word settle. She writes of another sister. Describes the way her voice rose during song, how her fingers lingered on a page too long, how her laughter came like spring after too many Lents. I do not know the name of this longing, she writes, but I know it is mine. There's no declaration, no climax, just that quiet ache of someone trying to hold a feeling without breaking it. It ends abruptly, mid-thought. You imagine her being interrupted, folding it away in a panic, never finishing what she started. It stuns you more than any theology ever has. Because it's real. Not doctrine, not myth. Just a woman like you who lived inside stone walls and found herself caught between faith and feeling. And she left something behind. Not much. Just a letter, but enough. You start looking for more. You return to the scriptorium with new eyes, combing the margins for notes, for initials, for small trails left behind by those who refuse to be entirely erased. You find a half-faded name, Soror Imelda, written next to a line from the Song of Songs. You find little hearts inked faintly beside verses about divine love. You find a poem, scrawled hastily on the last page of a missal that ends with, "May my soul rest where her hand last touched mine." No one ever taught you this history, the history that lives between the official lines. Most convents didn't encourage personal writing. It was considered risky, dangerous. If it wasn't sanctioned by a superior, if it wasn't scriptural, it could be burned, buried, or worse, misread. But some women wrote anyway. Letters, diaries, prayers. Sometimes hidden, sometimes disguised as spiritual meditations. These weren't meant for publication or posterity. They were meant to survive, somehow. Modern historians have pieced together a patchwork of these inner voices. Bits of correspondence between nuns that read like love letters. Journals that shift between praising Christ and mourning the absence of a particular sister's scent. One nun in 15th century Castile left behind a volume filled with reflections on divine union. Only someone noticed that the divine she described wore a veil and smelled of lavender and cloves. Some argue that this is all metaphor, that women in religious life simply didn't have language for emotional intimacy, so they borrowed spiritual terms. Others believe the metaphors were chosen because they were safe, a way to hide truth in plain sight. After all, who questions the phrase, "I long for her, as I do the Lord," if the writer wears a veil and lives behind a locked gate? You want to believe the second group is right, not just because it makes more sense, but because it makes you make more sense. Every time your heart stirs at a look, a touch, a song sung slightly off-key by someone with lips you've memorized, you want that to be part of something older, something real. You think of Sister Agnes again. You haven't spoken since the night in the sacristy, but the silence hasn't dulled anything. If anything, it's sharpened it. Every glance you trade now feels like a sentence unsaid. Every brush of cloth, of breath, is a prayer held just under the tongue. You want to write to her. You want to leave her something, like the letter you found. But that's exactly how women get caught. Paper leaves trails. So instead, you trace letters in your mind. You imagine what you'd say. "Dear sister, I have watched you for weeks, maybe months, maybe a lifetime. I do not know what this is, but I know that when you stand next to me, I remember what warmth feels like." That night, you sneak into the scriptorium and copy the letter, the one you found, word for word. You don't take the original. That feels too sacred. But you hide your version in the lining of your mattress, wrapped in wax cloth to protect it from moisture and discovery. It feels dangerous, sacred, alive. There's a fringe belief barely footnoted in modern theology that suggests letters between nuns were not just expressions of affection, but spiritual acts, that to write honestly from the heart was a form of divine offering. A prayer with ink, one mystic called it. You like that. You whisper it to yourself sometimes when no one is listening. And in the days that follow, you start to see signs of others doing the same. A slip of paper falls from a psalter in the chapel, folded into a heart. A line of poetry is scratched into the back of a wooden pew. The flame burns even under stone. A book in the library is marked repeatedly at verses describing Solomon's bride, especially the part where he says her kisses are sweeter than wine. Someone else is reaching, and whether they're reaching for God or for each other, you understand, you feel it, that deep, dangerous need to be known. Because holiness, you're beginning to realize, doesn't come from denial. It comes from presence, from being awake to your own desire, your own joy, your own longing. And maybe, just maybe, it comes from writing it down. So you write another line on a clean piece of parchment. Nothing fancy, no names, just this. She is the silence where I most feel heard. You tuck it behind the statue of Saint Scholastica, and you wait. It begins with a smell, something sharp and sweet and not quite right. You're walking through the herb garden when it hits you, carried on the wind like a secret that doesn't care who hears. It smells like crushed rose petals and burned hair, like sage and myrrh, like something old pretending to be new. You know it before you know it. Something is happening, something unapproved. By evening the whispers have started. Someone saw Sister Elodia in the orchard, barefoot, her face tilted to the sky, hands raised. Someone else swears she was speaking in a language no one recognised. A third says they saw smoke curling up from her cell after Compline. No fire, no candle, just thick perfumed air that made them feel dizzy. And just like that, the word gets passed, mouth to ear, prayer to suspicion, witchcraft. You've heard that word before, in the stories told during novitiate, in the sermons that warn about temptation and spiritual deviation, in the way the abbess's face tightens whenever a sister gets too curious about natural remedies or asks too many questions about dreams. Witchcraft is what happens when holiness gets out of control, when women begin channeling something the church doesn't authorise. And Elodia, she's never been particularly docile. You think back on her, the way she smiles when no one's looking, the way she sings harmony instead of melody during Vespers, the way she always has an herb tucked behind her ear or tied in a little pouch on her belt. She says she's keeping the old ways. You never asked what that meant, now you wish you had. Witchcraft accusations in convents weren't common, not in the formal sense. But they didn't have to be. A nun who showed too much independence, who bled too regularly from the hands, or who had dreams that turned into visions could find herself under scrutiny. Sometimes she was labelled blessed, sometimes she was labelled dangerous. Often it depended on how well liked she was, or how scared people were of what she represented. In the Middle Ages, a nun with a vision was a mystic, until she started saying things the men couldn't explain. Then she was something else, maybe a heretic, maybe a lunatic, maybe something worse. Elodia is none of these, she's just different. She knows how to blend herbs that calm cramps and stop bleeding. She knows which prayers to say over a sick lamb, which flowers to press under your mattress if you're having bad dreams. She's never tried to hide it. But now, that openness has turned into a target. The abbess calls her in for discernment. You know what that means, a long conversation that isn't a conversation at all. It's a weighing, a test. You're not invited, of course. But you stand outside the door and listen. The tone isn't angry, it's calm, too calm. Do you believe these practices bring you closer to God? The abbess asks. Elodia's voice, always steady, replies, They bring me closer to something. The silence that follows is louder than anything else. The church has always been uneasy with women who know too much, about plants, about pain, about the body's rhythms, and when that knowledge coincides with a little charisma and a few unexplained events, it doesn't take long before the word witch becomes more than a whisper. It becomes a verdict. Historical records back this up. Inquisitorial manuals full of warnings about nuns who consorted with spirits, who brewed unnatural teas, who whispered to each other late at night. The evidence is always flimsy, dried leaves, scratched marks in the stone, a birthmark in the wrong place. But the punishment can be very real. Public penance, solitary confinement, excommunication, and in some cases, worse. One particularly chilling case tells of a nun in 1421 who was accused of invoking demonic assistance to heal another sister's cough. The evidence? She had rubbed a balm made of honey and ash on the girl's chest. That's it. She confessed, under pressure, and was burned in the town square. Her ashes were scattered so no one could venerate her as a martyr. You think about that when you find a small charm under your mattress 2 nights later. A pouch tied with a red thread, filled with sage, rosemary, and dried lavender. It smells like Elodia. It also smells like danger. You're not sure if it's meant to soothe you or warn you. You don't tell anyone, not even Sister Agnes. The strange part is, none of this surprises you. In fact, it makes sense. If women in convents have always lived in the cracks between holiness and hunger, why wouldn't some of them reach for something older than Rome? Something that felt like power? Something that didn't require a man's approval? There's a fringe theory, found in the footnotes of obscure feminist histories, that medieval convents were the last inheritors of a female folk tradition older than Christianity itself, that behind the chants and candles were echoes of older rites, of goddesses replaced with saints, or rituals repackaged as prayers. And maybe that's what's happening here. Maybe Elodia didn't invent anything. Maybe she's just remembering. You find her again a few days later, seated alone by the fire pit. Her fingers are stained with something purple. She looks up when you approach but doesn't speak. Instead, she opens her hand and shows you a smooth black stone etched with tiny markings. "What does it mean?" you whisper. She shrugs. "Protection, probably." You sit beside her, say nothing. After a long moment, she says, "They'll leave me alone as long as nothing bad happens, but if someone gets sick, if someone starts dreaming too much again..." She doesn't finish the sentence. She doesn't need to. That night, the wind howls louder than usual. The trees outside the convent shake like they're trying to leave, and you wake from a dream you don't remember, your chest tight, your hands clenched. You find the charm again under your pillow. This time you don't move it. You sleep with it against your heart. They arrive at dawn, 3 men in stiff black robes, riding mules that snort like they know they're not welcome. You hear the hoofbeats before you see the faces, but you already know what this means. They don't wear armour or carry swords, just scrolls. One has a wooden chest strapped to his saddle that clinks when it moves. That's worse than a sword. It means documents. It means records. It means someone is about to be questioned in the name of God. The abbess meets them in the courtyard. Her back is rigid, hands folded in the exact centre of her belt rope. She bows slightly. They do not bow back. And that tells you everything. The Inquisition, when it comes to a convent, doesn't look like fire and screaming. It looks like stillness. Interrogation cloaked as conversation. The weight of Dipcomsbunt hidden behind a gentle voice and endless Latin. They take over the guest house, clearing it out before Vespers. You're not allowed near it. Not for cooking, not for cleaning, definitely not for eavesdropping. But someone always hears. The walls are old and the stones leak secrets if you press your ear against them long enough. Sister Elodia is the first to be summoned. Of course she is. She disappears behind the carved wooden door, her veil too bright against the grey stone. You imagine her sitting on a wooden stool while 3 men scribble notes and glance at each other like they have already decided who she is. You imagine her answering slowly, carefully. You imagine her refusing to lie. They question her for hours. When she emerges, her face is blank, her shoulders squared. But her eyes flick once toward you before she disappears into the chapel. You don't see her for the rest of the day. By evening, they start calling more names. No one says the word investigation. That would mean there's something to investigate. Instead, they call it a spiritual review. Just a few questions, just to ensure the purity of the house. But you've read the manuals, the ones you weren't supposed to find. You know how this works. First they ask about your habits, your prayers, whether you've had impure dreams, whether you've spoken out of turn or felt undue affection for another sister. Then they start naming names, not asking, suggesting. A nod is enough to condemn someone. A silence can be twisted into confession. You don't have to be guilty, you just have to be nervous. They call Sister Celeste the next morning. You don't see her again until evening prayers, and when you do, her mouth is tight, her hands trembling as she kneels. She doesn't look at you. Not once. Later you pass her in the hallway and brush her hand, just for a moment. Her fingers wrap around yours before letting go. Her grip is the only thing steady. She doesn't speak for 2 days. The Inquisitors start asking about strange behaviour, visions, dreams, unusual devotions. They want to know who prays too loudly, who writes without permission, who fasts beyond what's required. It's like they're measuring holiness not by obedience but by eccentricity. And in this place there's no shortage of either. It's a slow, quiet unravelling. You start hearing questions whispered behind doors. Have you ever seen Sister Leonie with anyone after curfew? Did Sister Agnes ever leave the chapel after Compline? Have you noticed signs of spiritual unrest? You try to stay small, invisible. But it's like waiting for rain in a stormless sky. You know it's coming. You just don't know when. And then one afternoon your name is called. A lay sister appears at your elbow during embroidery and says, "The visitors would like to speak with you." Your breath catches, but you nod. You follow her across the courtyard. Your feet numb, your palms slick with sweat. The door to the guest house yawns open like a mouth. Inside, the room is too warm. Candles flicker low, and the three men sit at a narrow table, parchment spread before them. One gestures to a chair. You sit. They smile, and then the questions begin. At first, they're harmless. How long have you been in the convent? What drew you to this life? Do you feel your heart is fully devoted to God? You answer carefully, honestly but not fully. Every word is a thread, and you know how easily one can unravel the whole garment. Then they get bolder. Have you had dreams of a troubling nature? Do you feel drawn to anyone in particular? Do you believe all of your sisters are equally devoted? You pause, just long enough for one of them to look up sharply. You think of Celeste, of her hands, her breath, the warmth of her letter, the line, "You're my prayer." You think of the pages hidden under your mattress, the scent of rosemary and lavender, the stone etched with runes. "No," you say, "I do not." It's a lie, but not the kind they can catch. One of them leans in. Have you ever heard whispers of unnatural affection between sisters? There it is, the phrase, like a knife dipped in honey. You blink slowly. "No," you say again, "nothing I would call unnatural." The silence stretches. One scribbles something, another frowns, the third just watches you. You don't move. They let you go, but you know it's not over. Later you find out that 4 sisters have been placed under temporary seclusion. Not punishment, not penance, just safety measures, the abbess says, to protect the integrity of the house. No one says which 4, you can guess. The inquisitors stay another week. They don't burn anyone, they don't excommunicate. That's not how it works here. They simply dig up what they can, plant seeds of fear, and leave before anything truly sprouts. It's enough. The silence they leave behind does more damage than any fire. After they're gone, everything feels brittle. Smiles are tighter. Confessions more frequent. Affection, once whispered in corners, now folds in on itself like dying light. Even Celeste doesn't write anymore. She stands beside you in prayer but keeps her hands to herself. You understand, but it breaks something in you, she saw. That night you take out the letter you copied, the one from the back of the St. Lucy text. You reread it slowly, then you burn it. Not because you regret it, but because you can't let them ever find it. Your body is a quiet battlefield, not in the dramatic, saintly way the sermons like to describe. No stigmata or demon-torn limbs, no writhing in some northern cells while angels appear in clouds of incense. No, it's more subtle than that. It's the growl in your stomach that you pretend not to hear, the ache in your spine after another night of sleeping on boards, the way your breath catches every time you think of something sweet and forbidden, and how you immediately chase it down with guilt, prayer, or both. Flesh is weakness. That's the message here. Not officially, of course. The rule of St. Benedict encourages balance. But in practice, balance looks a lot like deprivation. You're always a little too cold, a little too tired, a little too hungry. And that state of near emptiness is treated as virtue, like holiness lives in the absence of comfort. Food becomes a kind of moral exam. You eat what you're given, lukewarm beans, greyish root stew, the occasional sliver of fish on feast days, and you never ask for more. Hunger is considered holy. You fast during Advent, during Lent, before feast days. After feast days, when someone dies, when someone's born, when you've sinned, when you might have sinned. Sometimes you forget what it feels like to be full, and yet you still feel other kinds of hunger. Hunger that bread can't quiet. Hunger that doesn't make sense in this place of stone and silence, and you've been taught that this too is a test, one you're always failing. There's a strange tradition you've heard whispered from the older sisters about saints who starved themselves into ecstasy. St. Catherine of Siena survived on nothing but the Eucharist for months. Others lived on lettuce leaves and cold water, claiming it brought them closer to Christ. You tried it once, during a long Lent, eating only crusts and broth. You didn't find God. You found dizziness, a throbbing behind your eyes, dreams so vivid you woke up tangled in your sheets, certain someone had touched you. It's the fasting that makes it worse in a way. That hollowing out doesn't just quiet your body, it amplifies it. Makes you sensitive to the smallest things. The warmth of another person's skin when they pass you bread. The way the incense clings to your robes and makes you think of sweat, of heat, of closeness. When you're always on the edge of fainting, everything feels like temptation. They don't tell you that. No one explains how the physical and the spiritual blur so easily when your stomach is empty and your mind is trying to hold itself upright with prayer alone. You kneel, you chant, you fast, you try to direct every longing toward God. But sometimes the body short-circuits your good intentions. You remember one evening during silence when you found yourself watching Sister Leonie eat a fig. That's it, just a fig. But she peeled it slowly, carefully, and her tongue flicked over the skin like she was savouring something rare, and you felt your knees go soft. It wasn't even about her, it was about the wanting. And then there's sleep, or rather the lack of it. You rise before dawn for matins, sometimes waking in the middle of the night for the watch. You sleep lightly and rarely, and sleep deprivation does strange things to the soul. It makes your prayers blur. Your dreams intensify. You once dreamed of floating above the chapel, naked, your skin kissed by light that felt exactly like lips. You woke up with your thighs damp and your mouth full of someone's name. Not Christ's, but who do you tell that to? The priest? He'd mutter something about Satan's subtle snares. The abbess? She'd give you more chores, more fasting. As if sweating through 6 more hours of scrubbing will flush the lust from your bones. You tell no one. That's what most of you do. You hide it. You punish yourself in small, private ways. You kneel longer on the stone. You skip your portion of honey on feast days. You recite extra prayers, biting off each word like penance. One sister wraps a rough cord around her thigh so tightly it leaves a ring of bruises. She says it helps her remember to keep her body in check. You wonder what it is she's trying so hard to forget. There's a line in one of the old texts you copied last year. The body must be tamed, like a disobedient beast. And you believe that. Still do sometimes. But the older you get, the more that metaphor feels backward. Maybe your body isn't a beast. Maybe it's a messenger. Maybe it's trying to speak in ways you were never taught to understand. A fringe group of female mystics in the 13th century believed that fasting wasn't about punishing the flesh, but freeing it. That by stripping away distractions, food, comfort, control, they could enter into union with the divine not through pain, but through openness. One even described her hunger as the hollow where God poured his figure. You remember copying that and feeling goosebumps rise across your skin. But that kind of talk gets you watched. So instead, you eat your beans, you drink your thin wine, you sleep in 4-hour shifts and dream of hands that will never hold you. And when your body betrays you, when it warms at the wrong thought, clenches in the wrong moment, you tell yourself it's nothing, that you're strong, that this is what faith feels like. But it's not, is it? Faith doesn't have to hurt like this. Desire shouldn't feel like failure, and yet you've been trained to expect both. That night, lying in your cot with your stomach tight and your thighs burning from too much kneeling, you whisper to the ceiling, "Are you listening?" You imagine God looking down, not with wrath, but with weariness, as if he too is tired of being blamed for what your body already knew, and maybe, just maybe, that's the beginning of a new kind of prayer. Sometimes what your body doesn't receive, it learns to seek in other ways. In the convent, where touch is forbidden, warmth becomes a rare and reckless thing. But sensation finds its way in, like ivy climbing over the wall. You learn to savour things that no one could possibly forbid. The scent of thyme crushed underfoot, the softness of linen fresh from the sun, the honeyed edge of music during Vespers, the way the air tastes in spring, thick with rain and something that feels almost like forgiveness. One morning during candle duty, you catch yourself lingering over the beeswax. The heat of it, the scent. There's something tender in it, something almost maternal, like skin warmed by light. You breathe in deeply, then glance over your shoulder, half expecting someone to scold you. But no one's watching, or if they are, they pretend not to see. You've noticed lately how your senses have become sharper, how deprivation, strangely, has made you more alive to the details of everything around you. That's the paradox, isn't it? They think that if they deny you pleasure, you'll forget how to want, but instead you just learn to want better, smaller, quieter, more deeply. Sister Marianne teaches music. Her voice is low and smooth like velvet left in sunlight. When she sings the Agnus Dei, it's as if her words dissolve into something thicker than sound. You sit behind her in the chapel, not watching her exactly, just absorbing. And when she exhales at the end of the chant, you feel it in your skin, as if sound itself has found a way to touch you. That's the thing they never tell you about life in a convent, how loud silence can be, how every little thing you're allowed to feel becomes amplified, blooming larger than it has any right to. A faint breeze against your cheek during Lauds, the accidental brush of a sleeve during communion, the way someone's hair falls loose from her veil, just for a moment, and the shape of her neck takes your breath away. Sensation, once stripped of its obvious sources, gets smarter. There's an old belief, rare, fringe but persistent, that some nuns experienced mystical union not through visions or voices, but through touch, that God could be felt in the fabric of the world, that by truly paying attention to the physical you could unlock the spiritual. It was considered borderline heretical, too sensual, too risky, too easy to confuse ecstasy with arousal. But there are stories. One mystic claimed she felt Christ's presence in the warmth of freshly baked bread. Another said she saw angels in steam rising from bathwater. A third, a nun in France, was said to go into raptures whenever she held a certain book, not for what it said, but for how it felt in her hands. You understand that now. You're not chasing pleasure exactly. You're just trying to survive on scraps of beauty, and sometimes those scraps feel like feasts. One afternoon during kitchen duty, you stand beside Sister Celeste as she grinds cloves into a pot of stewed pears. The scent is overwhelming, sweet, spicy, warm. It makes you dizzy. She offers you a spoon to taste. You do slowly, and the flavour bursts across your tongue like light. You catch her watching you, just for a second, and in that glance something passes between you, faster than speech, deeper than prayer. Later, you wonder how something as small as clove and pear could feel like such a sin. And yet the sensory rules of the convent are very real. Baths are quick and cold, touch is limited to necessity. Smells are monitored, too much lavender, and someone might accuse you of vanity. Even your own voice must be controlled. You once laughed too loudly during recreation and were assigned an extra hour of kneeling, not because it was unholy, but because it was excessive. Everything must be moderate, restrained, decorous. But you've stopped believing that moderation is the same as holiness. You've begun to think that moderation is just fear in disguise. You remember one evening during Lent when the kitchen received a gift from a nearby village, a basket of oranges, real oranges, bright, plump, fragrant. You hadn't tasted one in years. You peeled it slowly, reverently, and the juice ran down your fingers, sticky and golden. You shared it with another sister, laughing softly as the segments fell apart in your hands. You've never prayed harder than you did that night, half in gratitude, half in shame, but you keep noticing things. The way candlelight reflects off glass, the softness of a calloused hand when it brushes yours, the music of wind in the courtyard. You even start to read scripture differently, seeing the sensual in passages no one discusses aloud. Your lips drop sweetness as the honeycomb, my bride. Milk and honey are under your tongue. Song of Songs again. The church says it's metaphor. You're not so sure. There's a scholar, modern speculative, who argued that medieval nuns were some of the most sensually attuned people of their time. Not because they were sinners, but because they were trained to pay attention to detail, to savour the texture of parchment, the fragrance of a chapel after Mass, the rhythm of breathing in a still room. When you strip a life down to its barest essentials, what's left becomes sacred. You hold that theory close. You begin to collect sensations like relics, a pressed violet found near the cloister wall, the roughness of raw wool against your arm, the echo of birdsong at dawn. Each one a tether to the physical world, each one a reminder that you're not just spirit and rule, you are flesh too, and the flesh is not your enemy. One night, lying in your cot with a breeze drifting through the high windows, you trace the edge of your blanket with your fingertips and let yourself feel everything. The warmth, the ache in your legs, the softness of your breath in the cool air. You imagine hands, lips, voices, not in a sinful way, but in a human one. You imagine God not as a blinding light, but as a sensation, a warmth at the edge of your skin, a sweetness on the tongue, a hand in yours, steady and strong, and for the first time in weeks you feel full. Sometimes you wonder if you're living in a memory, someone else's, not your own. Not the kind etched into parchment or carved into chapel walls, but a lingering echo, soft and stubborn, that refuses to fade. The convent feels like that more and more, a place suspended in time, repeating itself in loops so subtle that unless you're watching closely, you'd swear it was all new. But it's not. You've been here long enough now to see the pattern. The new novices arrive with round cheeks and wide eyes, whispering their prayers too loudly, tripping over their habits, burning their fingers on hot bread trays. They flinch at cold baths, blush when complimented, cry when they miss home, and then they change. The chapel bleaches them slowly. They kneel a little straighter, speak more quietly, touch less, laugh rarely. You remember when you were one of them, and now you're not. One morning, a new girl, barely 15, pale as parchment, approaches you after Lauds and asks where the infirmary herbs are kept. She's been assigned to Sister Elodia's old post. You watch her for a moment, this girl with hands too small for buckets and a voice that cracks when she says, "Excuse me." You take her to the storeroom, show her the labelled satchels, how to grind dried thyme without losing your fingernails. She watches with such intent that you forget to be suspicious, but part of you wonders what kind of woman she'll become here, who she'll be allowed to become. Later, during chores, you overhear two older sisters talking about her. She's a good girl, quiet, obedient. She won't cause trouble. That's always the highest compliment here. Not intelligent, not kind, not brave, just quiet, obedient, trouble-free. But you've begun to understand that trouble isn't the enemy. It's forgetting that you ever had a voice. You think of the ones who didn't forget. Sister Benicia, who laughed too loudly. Sister Magdala, who dared to carry Lid's life. Sister Elodia, who knew too much. Sister Celeste, who once traced her fingers along your spine and whispered, "I want to believe this is holy too." They were trouble, all of them. And that's why you remember them. You've started keeping a list. Not on paper, that's too risky, but in your head, recited like a litany before bed. Not saints, not martyrs, just names of women who reached beyond what the convent allowed. You mouth them like prayer beads, one by one, as if each name unlocks a little door in your soul. You wonder how many lists like this have been whispered over centuries, how many names have been carried secretly across generations, hidden in margins, embroidered into hems, baked into bread. There's a belief, ancient, whispered, never sanctioned, that some nuns passed their memories down in code. Recipes that doubled as stories, chants with secret harmonies, knots in their prayer cords that marked dates, people, touches. It's never been proven, of course, scholars argue endlessly, but you want it to be true. You want to believe that even in silence the truth found a way to speak. You begin to notice small things in your own routines, habits you've inherited without knowing. You always pray with one knee slightly raised, just like Sister Leonie. You braid your hair the same way Sister Agnes did when she thought no one noticed. You hum the same off-key line that Magdala used to sing when she thought no one was listening. None of it is sacred in the official sense, but it feels holy to you. One night you find a note tucked under your bedroll. Just a scrap, a single line in careful shaky Latin. Nos meminimus, we remember. No name, no signature, just that. You stare at it until your eyes blur. You don't know who left it. Maybe one of the novices, maybe an older sister who sees more than she lets on, maybe Celeste, though you haven't spoken beyond nods in weeks. It doesn't matter. What matters is that it exists, that you are not the only one remembering, and memory in a place like this is rebellion. Because the official record will never include the real story. The church documents what it needs to: births, deaths, admissions, penances, not longing, not softness, not the way someone once held your hand when you thought you might shatter, not the way a body hungry and aching can feel more like a prayer than any psalm. And so you remember it yourself. You remember the sound of the rain on the night they questioned you. You remember the weight of a gaze you weren't supposed to return. You remember the warmth of a clove-scented breath shared over a steaming pot. You remember the names. You carry them like candles, lit and low and hidden. And slowly you begin to see that you're not just remembering, you're becoming part of the memory itself, part of the loop. A future sister will walk these same halls, hear your name whispered in a half-forgotten story and wonder what kind of woman you were, what kind of trouble you caused. You hope she carries you with her the way you carry the others. That night you climb to the top of the cloister roof where no one goes after dark. The wind is sharp. The stars are sharp too. You lie on your back, feeling the cold seep through your robes, and whisper your list to the sky. Then finally your own name. You whisper it like you mean it. You whisper it like it belongs, and it does. They say the body forgets eventually, that if you deny it long enough, desire, touch, sleep, warmth, it will go quiet. Settle into obedience like an old dog that's finally learned the leash. But your body, stubborn thing that it is, has other plans. It doesn't forget. It stores. Tucks sensations into bone and breath, keeps them warm and pulsing, waiting for a moment when the mind finally lets its guard down. That moment comes, uninvited, in the middle of a perfectly ordinary task. You're sweeping the stone corridor that runs behind the chapel. The air smells of dust and incense and some lingering sharp tang of candle smoke. The bristles scratch softly against the floor. Your mind drifts, as it always does now, because it has nowhere else to go. And then a hand brushes your shoulder. Just a touch, light, casual, but you freeze. It's Sister Celeste. You haven't spoken since the Inquisitors left. Not really. She's been quiet. Her smile's polite and distant, as if the walls haven't just been built higher around you, but inside her too. But now she's here, her fingers hovering over your shoulder, like she's not sure if she's allowed to stay. "I thought you might need help," she says. You nod, because your mouth has forgotten how to make words. She takes the broom from you. Your fingers graze as she does. That 1 second is louder than the bells that call you to prayer. The silence that follows is heavy, not empty. It's the kind of silence that hums with all the things you're not supposed to say. You sweep side by side. The space between you becomes a question mark, curved and expectant. After a while, she speaks. "I left something," she says, so quietly you're not sure you heard her right. You glance over. "In the Psalter," she adds, without looking up. Later that night, after Compline, you sneak into the chapel. It's cold. The candles have long since guttered out, but you know the way by heart. You find the Psalter on the third pew, exactly where she used to sit. You flip slowly, fingers trembling. There's a pressed flower, a violet, fragile, nearly weightless, a note folded beneath it. You remembered. So I remembered Hander too. You don't cry, not here, but something inside you loosens, like a knot finally giving up after being pulled too tightly for too long. This is how it begins again. Not with declarations or grand confessions, not even with a touch, but with a flower and a sentence. The next morning she sits beside you at breakfast. Nothing dramatic, just a shift in placement. A choice. You eat your bread slowly, hyper-aware of the space where your arm brushes hers. You don't speak, but her hand rests flat on the table, close enough to touch. She doesn't move it. Neither do you. There's a term, affective mysticism, used by certain historians to describe the spiritual practices of medieval women who emphasized emotion, sensation, and the love of Christ as felt experience. Critics often accuse them of confusing the divine with the sensual, but others argue that they weren't confused at all. They were claiming something, claiming that holiness could be embodied, that love didn't need to be sterilized to be sacred. You wonder where the line is, between divine affection and human longing, between sisterly love and something that dares to have a heartbeat. Maybe there is no line. Maybe the church just drew one so no one else could. Celeste begins to leave you small things, a clove tucked into your cup, a fragment of a hymn you both love, scribbled on the back of a discarded recipe, a stone smoothed by river water, placed gently on your windowsill. Each one is a sentence in a language you are both still learning to speak. You respond in kind, a square of wool for her cold hands, a bookmark shaped from a dried fig leaf, a line from the Song of Songs, copied carefully into the margin of her breviary. Place me like a seal over your heart, for love is as strong as death. You know the risks. Of course you do. If you're caught, the consequences are clear. Separation, isolation, maybe worse. Not because you've broken a vow in the legal sense, but because you've broken the illusion. The nuns are pure not only in body but in spirit, that your lives are devoid of hunger, that love, if it exists, lives only in a sterile light. But you've stopped believing in that illusion. Not because you're rebellious, because you're alive. You begin to move differently, more carefully, but also more deliberately. A touch passed between you and the cloister, a shared glance across the chapel. a hymn sung in quiet harmony that leaves your hands trembling in your lap. One night during recreation, she brushes a strand of hair from your face. The motion is slow, reverent. You could pull away. You don't. Afterward, she says nothing, but when she passes you in the corridor the next morning, she slips a tiny square of parchment into your hand. You wait until you're alone to open it. It reads, "If this is wrong, then let me never be blameless." You sit on the edge of your bed, knees drawn up, and stare at the words for a long time. You don't have the courage to answer right away, but you keep the note tucked into your sleeve, and every time your fingers brush against it, your pulse quickens. The love you're building isn't loud, it's not even spoken most of the time. But it's steady, patient. It moves like water finding its own path beneath the stone. And in a place where every emotion must be rationed, where every touch is suspect, that is the most sacred thing of all. It doesn't take long for the others to notice. They don't say it outright. No one would dare. But the air changes. You feel it in glances held a little too long, in conversations that end when you enter a room, in the way Sister Jeanne clutches her rosary more tightly when you pass. It's not that they know exactly. It's that they sense the shift, the warmth, the way your silences now feel charged instead of empty. And in a place where silence is sacred, even the wrong kind of quiet can make the walls whisper. You and Celeste begin to meet during the hour before Matins. Not in secret, not really, just discreetly. The herb garden is empty at that hour, still shrouded in shadow, the stone walls radiating the last of the night's cold. You sit on the bench near the rosemary bush and speak softly, sometimes not at all. One morning she brings you a bit of honey on a crust of bread. "I dreamed of you," she says. You chew slowly. "What happened?" She smiles. "You were reading. I don't know what, you wouldn't tell me. You just looked up and said, 'You don't have to be afraid anymore.' Then I woke up." You don't respond right away, but your hand reaches for hers, finds it, or holds, and that's when you realise you're not just falling in love. You're building something small, yes, but real. A kind of chapel within a chapel, made of half-finished thoughts, shared glances, warm fingers, the things they can't catalogue or control. The Church has always struggled to understand relationships like this. There are letters from abbots centuries ago, puzzled and uneasy, trying to explain why Sister Maria and Sister Clara insisted on sharing a cell, why they wept when separated, why their prayers always ended with each other's names. The official explanations are clumsy: spiritual friendship, misplaced devotion, excessive affection. But if you read between the lines, always between, you find the truth. One 14th century chronicler noted that some sisters form bonds so intense that it draws suspicion. He meant it as a warning, you read it as a sign of life. But the warnings still matter. You start being more careful, less lingering. Fewer notes, glances only when necessary. You avoid sitting beside each other at meals, you pray in separate pews, you practice looking indifferent. It feels unnatural, like trying to hold your breath for hours. One evening, while scrubbing the refectory floors, Celeste leans in just a little too close, her voice barely above a whisper. "I hate pretending you're no one." You nod. "I know, but it keeps you here." She says nothing after that. Just hands you the bucket. "Boz, your fingers brush. That's enough." There's an odd relief in the simplicity of your bond. It isn't about sex. You've never crossed that line, though the Church would argue you already have, emotionally, spiritually, but for you, it's not about rules, it's about recognition. The moment someone sees you and still stays. That's what you've always craved more than anything. That's what convent life was supposed to offer. Community, unity, love. And it does, but only within boundaries that don't fit the shape of your heart. The older nuns speak often of unity, of sisterhood, of spiritual marriage to Christ. But when you ask what that feels like, they offer metaphors and doctrine, not lived experience. None of them talk about lying awake at night, body burning, simply because someone said your name too gently. None of them admit that they might have once wanted something, or someone, outside the edges of Scripture. But you see the past in their eyes. You catch it sometimes when the abbess stares too long at a veil left on a bench, or when Sister Marianne closes her eyes during a hymn and holds the final note just a little longer than necessary. They remember, or they've chosen to forget, and the memory keeps sneaking back. There's a poem you once read, hidden in the back of an illuminated manuscript, just 6 lines. No attribution. I saw her in the sunbeam's light, her eyes on Christ, her hands on thread, but still I watched her chest rise bright, and knew what holy text had said, that fire dwells where hearts are true, and sometimes that fire burns too. You copied it down in your own hand, folded it into your prayer book, and read it when the ache becomes too much. You've never shown it to Celeste. Some things feel too private to share, even with the person who holds your ribs together. Then one night everything changes. Sister Aimee falls ill. Just a fever, the kind that comes and goes, but she's popular, well-liked. And when she begins muttering in her sleep, someone suggests it's not illness. It's a spiritual disturbance. The old suspicions rise again. The Inquisitors are long gone, but their echoes remain. And soon someone asks whether there's been undue influence among the sisters. Tensions. Unnatural attachments. The abbess begins watching again. Not harshly, but closely. You and Celeste don't speak for 2 days, not even in passing. On the 3rd day you find a note tucked into your book of hours. 3 words, and let them try. It isn't defiance, not exactly. It's something deeper, steadier. A decision. That night, under cover of darkness, you meet in the laundry. No one goes there after compline. It smells of lye and cold water, and the floor is damp, but it's yours, for a moment at least. She kisses you. Not with hunger, not with fear, just with truth. Her mouth is warm, soft, your body responds with a shiver that feels like a prayer answered. You don't say anything, you just breathe. When you part, she rests her forehead against yours. I'm not afraid of loving you, she says. Neither are you. Not anymore. It doesn't end in fire, not in exile, not even in whispered judgment that turns to open scorn. That's the strangest part. You were prepared for punishment, had braced your spine for it, rehearsed what you'd say when called to account. You expected separation, silence, cold stone walls between your beds, your names no longer spoken together. You expected to be made an example. But instead, the world just keeps turning. Sister Aimee recovers. The rumours cool like wax after the candle burns down. The abbess returns to her usual stern serenity, the way a tree returns to stillness after wind. And Celeste is still there, kneeling beside you during matins, her lips barely moving as she sings, still tending to the sick with the same careful hands, still leaving small things for you to find, as if to say, we are still here, still choosing this. No one says anything, not really, but their silence shifts. The sisters who used to look away now meet your eyes. One of them, Jeanne of all people, nods during a recreation and says, "You seem more yourself lately." It's the kind of compliment that pretends not to be a question. You nod back. Maybe I am. She doesn't press, and that's when it dawns on you. Maybe they always knew. Or maybe they just understand. In a place filled entirely with women, pressed against rules designed by men, how could there not be moments like this? How many stories have bloomed and wilted in these stone corridors? How many hands have brushed, lips lingered, bodies burned and then moved on quietly, still whole? You're not the first, you won't be the last. You begin to move through the convent with a strange, humming clarity. The same stone walls, the same rote tasks, but everything feels more. Your body no longer whispers its wants in secret. It walks beside you now, not tamed, not guilty, but integrated. You're not broken, you're not possessed. You're simply, fully here. You still pray, still chant, still feel the tremble of awe when you look at a stained glass saint glowing gold in the morning sun. But you don't confuse devotion with denial anymore. You don't confuse suffering with righteousness. And you don't let them tell you that what you feel, what you and Celeste feel, is somehow less divine. There's a shift happening, subtle and soft, like this changing of seasons before anyone names them. Sister Leonie and Sister Marianne begin walking arm in arm again. The novices linger longer together in the courtyard. Laughter has returned, not in defiance, but in relief. And then one morning you find a new verse pinned to the linen line. Love does not envy. Love does not boast. Love sings where it is not supposed to. It's unsigned. Of course. But when you look across the courtyard and find Celeste watching you, the smallest smile pulling at her lips, you know it doesn't need to be. You add it to your list, the mental one, the one you recite each night before sleep. But now the names have changed. No longer just the ones who dared and were punished. Now, the ones who remained. The ones who created love in impossible places. The ones who found grace not in rules, but in tenderness. That list is growing. You still wake early, still kneel on cold stone, and still feel hunger gnaw at you during fast days. But now you understand those things differently, not as punishment, but as part of the story. Your body is not a cage, it's a vessel, a text, a second psalter written in skin and nerve and heartbeat. You stop hiding your softness. You let yourself smile fully when Celeste enters the room. You sit beside her again at meals. You touch her hand when the candles are blown out and no one is looking. Not because it's secret, but because it's yours. Some nights you climb to the cloister roof where the wind is sharp and the stars are shameless. You lie on the cool tiles and let yourself feel everything. The ache in your thighs from kneeling, the lingering heat from a glance, the low hum of music you're no longer singing aloud. You press a hand to your chest and whisper, "I was here, I loved." And that, you've decided, is enough. You begin writing again, carefully. Not confessions, not declarations, just small truths. Sentences that might survive beyond your hands. You hide them in the bindings of books, in the lining of habits. You write the names of women who mattered. You write down smells and sounds and touches. You write your story in bits, as if laying breadcrumbs for a future soul to follow. Because someone will. A girl will arrive years from now, wide-eyed, obedient, uncertain. She will kneel in your old place she will feel the strange pull between devotion and desire. And maybe, just maybe, she'll find your writing, or your flower, or your stone etched with a word that isn't Latin but still means love. And she will know she isn't the first, and that she won't be the last. You're still a nun, still behind walls, still bound by prayers and seasons and ritual, but you are also free. And freedom, you've learned, doesn't always look like escape. Sometimes it looks like choosing someone's hand, sometimes it looks like kissing her once, in a laundry room that smells of lye and soap, and knowing that kiss will live in your blood longer than any sermon. Sometimes it looks like staying, and tonight you stay. You lie beside Celeste in your narrow cot just for a moment, her breath warm against your shoulder, her fingers tracing circles on your wrist like you're a psalm she hasn't finished reading yet. You close your eyes, you exhale, and for the first time in your life you feel entirely, dangerously, divinely whole. And now, with all that's said after 30 sections and a journey deep into stone corridors, candle-lit secrets, whispered names, forbidden glances, and the unbearable holiness of touch, you lie there, staring up at the ceiling of your cell, which somehow feels less like a prison and more like a sky. The story has ended, but the weight of it still presses gently across your chest, like a woolen blanket, warm, heavy, and earned. You're not alone, even now. Maybe you never were. Maybe behind every monastery wall and every convent rule and every silencing decree there were always hands reaching out in the dark, writing love into margins, pressing violets between pages, kissing fingertips when no one was looking. Maybe holiness was never meant to be as narrow as the path they made you walk. Maybe it was always big enough to include longing and scent and touch, and the impossible tenderness of being fully seen. So now close your eyes and listen to the creak of wooden pews settling at night, to the breath of the wind across the cloister roof, to the heartbeat of someone lying beside you, not in body perhaps, but in memory, in echo, in defiant joy. Let yourself feel it, the sacredness of softness, the rebellion of being tender in a world that asked you to be hard. The holy fire of choosing love anyway. You were here, you loved. That's enough. Sleep now, safely tucked in the folds of this story. You're carried by centuries of women who felt exactly as you do. Too much, too deeply, too beautifully to be erased.